All right, good morning. Y'all look great today. Happy, alert, ready for a good day of training, yeah? Okay, good. It's an honor to introduce our next instructors who are some of my personal favorites at the LLA, both great people to work with. Our first instructor, so you have two instructors today. Angela Heath is going to kick off the first session, and then Patrick Virgadamo is going to follow. Angela Heath is a senior attorney for our office. She graduated from Southern Methodist University in Dallas, where she received her BA in English and BA in broadcast journalism. She received her JD from Loyola University in New Orleans School of Law and her LLM. I don't even know what that is. I'm not going to lie. Master's in Law, good job, from Tulane University School of Law. Mrs. Heath began her career serving as a judicial law clerk for Justice Catherine D. Kitty Kimball on the Louisiana Supreme Court before going into private practice. In 2012, Ms. Heath served as a senior parish attorney for the parish of Jefferson before joining the LLA in February 2016. In her capacity as senior attorney to the legislative auditor, Ms. Heath researches and writes opinions on numerous and various questions facing the auditor's office, state and local officials, and public entities. Ms. Heath is certified as a state agency ethics liaison and certified ethics trainer with the Louisiana Board of Ethics. She is also a certified fraud examiner and a member of the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. Ms. Heath is admitted to practice in Louisiana and North Carolina. Our second instructor today, who you'll see in just a little bit after Angela's presentation, is Patrick Virgadamo. Patrick is a senior attorney for our office. He's a graduate of McNeese State University, Louisiana State University, and LSU Paul M. Hebert Law Center. Patrick began his career at the LLA as a law clerk in May of 2008 before joining the LLA full-time as a staff attorney in August of 2009. In November 2015, Patrick assumed his current role as senior attorney. Patrick is licensed as a practicing attorney before the Louisiana State Bar and Eastern, Western, and Middle U.S. districts of Louisiana. In his capacity as attorney with the legislative auditor, Patrick researches and writes opinions on numerous and various questions facing the auditor's office. Patrick also assists in responding to questions submitted by state and local officials and public entities. Patrick is certified as a state agency ethics liaison and certified ethics trainer with the Louisiana Board of Ethics. Patrick is also a certified fraud examiner and member of the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners. Patrick serves as an instructor for CLGE, and he also assists LLA's general counsel and human resources in drafting numerous office policies, such as the LLA crisis leave, military leave, sexual harassment, and professional development policies. That was a mouthful, huh? Y'all give it up for Patrick and Angela. Angela's going to start.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Angela, like Lizzie just introduced me. I'm very happy to be here to talk to you today about the rules of procurement. Now, I'm going to go ahead and just put my glasses on and pretend, I like to pretend I don't need them all the time, but I basically do at this point, so I'm going to go ahead and wear them. We're going to go over today the public bid law, exceptions to the public bid law, and requests from proposals. That's all in Title 38. Then Patrick's going to take over, and he's going to talk to you more about the Office of State Procurement, how you can use that office to do things such as buying things off of state contract. That's all in Title 39, and the federal procurement standards, which is 2 CFR 200. If you've ever dealt with GOSEP or after a hurricane weather event, you are probably familiar with 2 CFR 200. At least you've heard that before. Our focus is going to be today a very in-depth look at these various ways of buying things and to give you an idea of when you need to use each one, not just what they say, how to do them, but when is the best time to use the different types of processes. The purpose of all these rules, if you ever wonder why you have to jump through so many hoops to buy, your paper clips in your office, it's because of the focus on transparency in government. This is the public dollar that you're using, not your own money. You know, you can go and overpay for something that you really want, but for the public, you always have to keep in mind that you're spending someone else's money and you need to be open and transparent with the public's business. And really, your responsibility starts from $1. You'll see today as we go through these rules that there's certain dollar limit thresholds, right? You don't have to do something until you reach a certain dollar amount. Then it triggers these processes. But our state constitution, Article 7, Section 14, says that public money cannot be lent, donated, or pledged to any person, association, or corporation, public or private. What that means is that every public dollar has you to be a fiscally prudent manager of that public dollar. Now, I'll start with the public bid law. This is in Title 38, as I said. The public bid law was enacted in the interest of taxpayers to protect them against contracts public officials would make that use favoritism to give them, you know, to friends or to relatives, and to prevent against exorbitant prices. So what that means is that every transaction using public dollars should be an arm's length transaction. There's no favoritism. Everyone's treated the same. It's not a related party. And, you know, no $500 hammers, that you're being wise with what you get. You're getting a good value for what you're spending the public dollar on. It is also a prohibitory law. What that means legally is that the public entity has no authority to take action that is inconsistent with the public bid law. It has to be in the public bid law in order for you to do it. Think of this like baking. Okay? You can be a really good cook. My mom is a good example. She's a really good cook, and she just when you ask her what you put in it, she doesn't even know. The kitchen's a mess. Every cabinet's open. She's got all kinds of spices all over the place. She doesn't even know how much of what she put in it, right? She just goes by feel or whatever, right? So you can't ask her how she did it. But with baking, if you don't follow that recipe precisely, the cake doesn't rise, right? If bakers in here know that. You have got to be exactly strict step by step when you're baking to make that cake properly. That is what all of these laws really are. The public bid law, the procurement code, and the federal rules. Think of it like you're baking a cake, and be very precise with what you're doing and monitoring what you're doing. Now, in the public bid law, there are two types of contracts. There's contracts for materials and supplies, and there's contracts for public works, which we're going to go over in depth. Services are not included in the public bid law. So keep that in mind, and we'll go over that. What are services? Like professional services, attorneys, other types of services like that, and we'll go over that. So that you don't have to bid those out. But no matter what, Article 7, Section 14 still applies here, right? So you still have to be wise with the public dollar. So we do recommend some things to do when it comes to professional services that we will talk about. Now, right now, the thresholds, that's what it's called legally, for contracts for materials and supplies is $60,000, and for public works, which is construction, is $250,000. Those were just raised back in the 2020 session to these higher thresholds. Before, if you recall, the public works threshold was changing every year based on the CPI. According to right now in the law, in 2025, that CPI will start going into effect again, and it'll change yearly unless the legislature takes some other type of action. But right now, for our discussion, the thresholds are $60,000, $60,000 for materials and supplies, and $250,000 for public works. So what's materials and supplies? Well, the actual definition in the law says material and supplies are materials and supplies. So that's not really a good definition. It's not really defined there. But in the context, what it is movable property. If you can pick something up and move it across the room without having to go through a whole construction process, that's going to typically be materials and supplies. It would also include stuff like equipment, vehicles, tractors, things like that. Any type of movable property that you need to run your entity's business would be a material and supply. So the standards. If it's less than $30,000, the rule is prudent person standards. Because again, Article 7, Section 14 of the Constitution, be good stewards of the public money. We recommend that you get 3 quotes. You can call around, they can be telephone quotes. We also recommend that you document your file. We're going to talk a lot about documenting files today. What does that mean? It can be electronic. It can be electronically saved. That might even be a better practice right now with the world that it's in, so you don't have all that paper stacked up. But you want to keep a recording, memos to the file, notes to the file of your quotes. I also think, and it's a good practice to have written manuals of how you're going to go through your procurement process. Follow along with the law. We have good resources on the LLA's website. We have what we call an FAQs, all the different public laws. We have one for the public bid law. You could use that as a guideline of how you're going to handle the different levels of procurement. Are you going to require the 3 telephone quotes and notes to the file when there's a purchase for less than $30,000? So have written documentation and manuals. It doesn't have to be overly complex, but it should be written down so that you can remember what you did. But also, more importantly, years from now, if someone has to come back and look at it, or your auditor at the next year comes back and look at it, they can see what you did, right? That makes sense? If anybody has any questions, please let me know. Okay.
Angela, I have an online question.
Sure.
If you pass money down to a subrecipient that's state or federal, who is responsible for adhering to the procurement laws?
Well, that's a kind of vague on the facts type of question. How did you pass this down? They're a subrecipient, so they're supposed to be contracting. They're fulfilling the contract. They're not a vendor. You are ultimately responsible for any type of grant that you get or any type of money that you get, and that's where monitoring comes in. Okay, if you're going to let that person take over the purchasing of the items needed, then you need to monitor how he's doing that and make sure he's following the law. But ultimately, the entity that gives the money to the subrecipient is going to be responsible. Okay, so 30 to 60,000. So okay, we can move on from that. Okay. $30 to $60,000. You are required now. It's not optional. It's not just best practice. You are required to get 3 telephone, fax, email, or other printable electronic form of bids. I think that means you can go on the website from the vendor and download what's displayed on their website. Keep a copy of that in your file. We get a question a lot. Do you have to go with the lowest bidder in the $30 to $60,000 range? Technically, you don't. But if you don't go with the lowest one, it's not a bidder, the lowest price. I'm sorry, my mistake. If you do not, you should have a justification as to why you did not. For example, I had someone who called me and it was under $60,000 and it was like a little refrigerator type thing, not a big one. And he said, well, I want to take the guy that's like $200 more because he can have it to me here in a week. And the other guy's going to take, he says it's 3 to 4 weeks before he can delivery. Well, a faster delivery could be a justification of going with the one who's a slightly higher on their quote. So you should, yes, take the lowest quote unless there's some type of circumstance that you can justify that's reasonable, not just that you like this guy better, okay? But a faster delivery would be something, a better warranty on the product that you're buying or something like that. Now, greater than $60,000, that's what triggers the letting it out for bid. That triggers the process with the advertisement, you can do electronic bids, advertise at least 15 days before opening a bids, and you open all the bids or you cancel the bids. We'll go into that a little bit more, yes. Yes, you do. That does not, even if you, yes, that's good. I've got that under electronic bids. You have to do electronic bidding for public works for sure. You may for materials and supplies, but that does not alleviate the requirements to advertise in the newspaper. That's why you had to be very careful to make sure you plan out and look at your calendar of when you're going to go out for bid on something to know that you can get it into the paper on time, because there are rules of the opening of bids. For the public work, for materials and supplies, for example, you can't open the bids. It's got to be at least 15 days before bid opening. It can be more, all right? But it's got to be in the newspaper at least 15 days before the opening of the bids. So you have to, and I understand that is a problem a lot nowadays with newspapers, so that's why you had to be really careful and plan. Get out your calendar, which I was just going to say, the advertising for bid, that is going to require planning. You need to count your days and plan ahead when you're going out for bid. Your amount, you have to have the money budgeted and know that you can afford something and reasonably how much it's going to cost you. That's a reasonable estimate. Maybe you think something should come in around, $40,000, and then when you start getting quotes, you're seeing it's really more around $50,000. You have to stop again and say, do we have the money in the budget to buy this? It's coming in higher than we thought. So you're not tied. It doesn't have to be set in stone, your estimate, because people always say, well, I don't know how much it's going to come in. You have to give a reasonable estimate. A way to estimate things that you commonly buy is to look at past year's budgets, the last 2 years. How much did you spend on this type of item? And then make your reasonable estimate before you go to even know if you on the threshold of do you have to go out to bid on it, or is it the quote type of thing? But it's a reasonable estimate. You also have to know, how are you going to receive these bids? Are you going to do electronic? Nowadays, people really like electronic, and they receive electronic. Again, does not alleviate your need to advertise in the paper. And your selection. You have to have your bid opening where all the bids are opened and read aloud. And then your contract formation, your purchase order. You should have your contracts always following your specs in your bid. You're getting what you advertised for. If you're getting something else than what you let out for bid, somewhere made a mistake, right? You need to rethink that. Did you bid this properly?
Angela, I have a question again.
Oops, I got my slides out of the time. Okay. Oh, that's what it is. I'm sorry.
If someone submits a bid and has the correct number written out in number format, but when they write it out, write it incorrectly, does that negate the bid?
That's a very, very, very close call. I don't know. Actually, I would actually ask the Attorney General on that. They're so specific on bids. There was a case where the instructions said, now it was I think it was a Public Works, they said those instructions were fill in every blank, don't leave any blanks. And so what should have been done is the bidder should have written a 0 in that blank, or a line through, or an NA on that line, because he had a 0 price for that, and he left it blank. And that happened in a couple of spots, and it was ruled to be non-responsive bid. So I don't know. I mean, I think written out is what a bank would take rather than the numbers. The banks, I know the rule in a bank is what the person writes on the line, 1,000, is what goes. If up on the other little part they write 100, but they write out 1,000 on the line, they'll go with the written one out. But honestly, I can't think of a case where that's been discussed, so I don't want to. That's very close.
And I have one more question.
Yes.
Is there any circumstance where you can cancel all bids?
Yes, you can cancel all bids in many circumstances, which we will go over. One of them is, turns out you don't have the money. What if all bids come out over your reasonable estimate? You can cancel all those bids. If everybody is a non-responsible bidder, now, which we're going to talk about. You had your hand up. Yes, sir. Yeah, oh yeah, they're still all public record, even though you canceled them, yes. Everything you're going to get in your office, that's a whole different talk that we do. Anything you get in your office that's part of the business of running your office is public record, okay? Now, does every bit of, well, that's going too much in there, but anything you receive as part of your daily workings of your office is a public record when you're a governmental entity. Now, your selection of your bidder. which we're kind of talking about. For materials and supplies, it says selection of the lowest responsible bidder. What does that mean? That means if someone comes in and they have the lowest bid, or even before they bid, you know this person. You've dealt with them before. They don't deliver on time. The stuff they give to you is of poor quality. It doesn't last, it's breaking down all the time. They filed bankruptcies several times and started a new company, one back to back right after the other, right? Something that tells you that this is not somebody that you want to do business with. You can move to have them declared a non-responsible bidder. There are procedures for that. You have got to give this person due process in order to do that. And there are specific rules to do it. It's in the Public Works law, but the Attorney General is 382212X, I think. But the Attorney General has said that you can use for materials and supplies the same type of process. You have to give them due process. You have to give that person the proposed bidder or the apparent low bidder. If you waited till after you open the bids to do it, you have to give him written notice and the reasons why you're going to disqualify him or her, okay? You have to give that person an opportunity to be heard, like an administrative informal hearing. And he will be able to come in and talk to a pre-selected panel of people who handle these things. This should be a written policy in your office of how these who's going to be on there to judge the person at the hearing administratively of why you're wrong. He's changed his ways. He's found the light. He's no longer that person that you think he is. I don't know what he's going to say, all right? So you have to do that hearing before you actually award the job, okay? And it has to be, you have to do it before you can take any adverse action after him. Against that person. That has to be done at least 5 business days after the date of the notice of the disqualification. You have to issue, so you give them the notice, the hearing has to be set no sooner than 5 days after the written notice, right? So you have the hearing 5 days later, and then within 5 days, no, not later than 5 days, you give him the written determination. Then you have to wait 5 more days before you can award the contract to the next lowest bidder or whatever. Maybe if you did this before the bid process even happened, it's even better. After that time, that person, the disqualified bidder, has the right to go to court to get an injunction, seek whatever type of remedies the court will give him for the action that you've taken against him. So you have to give the due process, and you should use it sparingly. In real cases, not just because you don't like a person. Make sure you have a real good justification of why you're doing this. Okay, so let's talk about some little scenarios and talk about some issues with materials and supplies that come up. If you know that the city uses $6,000 of paper every month, what threshold does this come under? Can anyone tell me? What do you think? Do you have to bid it out, or can you just go buy that $6,000 worth of paper? You have to bid it out, and I'll tell you why. It's not the $60,000 threshold, right? The Attorney General says these type of contracts, things that you buy regularly, routinely, month to month, what you need to do is figure out your reasonable estimate of what you use in a fiscal year. So if you use, according to you're looking at your past budgets, you use about $6,000 a month in paper times 12, that's $72,000. That is over the $60,000 limit. So then you do have to bid that out. You can't just wait and buy month to month. And what's the best thing, what you usually do is you get what's called a requirements contract from some type of people. You have them bid out what their unit price on paper is. Some months you might buy $6,000, some months you might buy $5,000, sometimes you might buy $8,000, depending on what's going on. So it doesn't have to come out to exactly your estimate, like I've told you again, but you're going to be doing this on a month-to-month basis, so you want to get your fiscal average what you spend in a fiscal year to decide to determine whether you need to bid this out. And this is also helps you with your rule in the public bid that you cannot split purchases to avoid letting something out for bid. That is a rule in the public bid law. You cannot get yourself artificially under that threshold so you can just go out and buy things or just only get quotes on things. That's called splitting, and it's not allowed. So this would most typically be a requirements contract. You guys probably have those in your offices for things like paper supplies, paper clips, things like that. Okay, so the fire department hired a new fireman, and he needs a respirator for him that costs $8,000. That's part of their equipment, their firefighting equipment. And judging from the condition of the respirators on hand, the chief can see that 7, while still in working condition, are basically on their last legs. And they'll probably need to be replaced before the end of the fiscal year. So the total for all 8 respirators is $64,000. Can the fire department just buy each respirator when they need arises, or should they bid them out altogether? I think that's kind of the same question as before, right? That if you know you have the need for this fiscal year for 8, and it's going to be a total of $64,000, you should bid that out. Now, the second part of the question, what if the other 7, they're really actually pretty good. Fire chief doesn't think he's going to need to replace those till next year. That could be a reason, a justifiable reason, not improper splitting reason, to just go ahead and buy that one $8,000 now and wait till next year when you need them to buy those 7 in that fiscal year. Because you're doing that for a fiscal reason. It's different fiscal years. It's not within the same fiscal year, right? So that would not be improper splitting. Another thing with these types of things, you can do multiple year contracts. So fire chief could say, well, you know what, I need this one now for sure. I'm going to need some time now or next year. I'm going to bid them all now. I'm going to bid for a multiple year contract so I can buy these respirators as needed, but after I've bid them out from the same, kind of like a requirements contract, but for this fire equipment.
And Angela, can
Yes.
you clarify splitting as it regards to state contracts?
Well, I don't know what you mean by that question.
I think a few people are asking if you buying things off a state
State
contract, you have to worry about splitting.
as we're going to talk about, when you buy off of a state contract, the state contract is a provision in the public bid law that allows you to basically not follow the public bid law. So splitting would not be an issue when you're buying off of state contract. It's a special provision, because what has happened there is the state has pre-bid a whole bunch of stuff, and Patrick's going to take you through step by step on the website so you can see it. They've got all kinds of things on there. The state has already gone through a bid process to get the best price, to be responsible, so you can buy one at a time. Yes, that's something else I could, if that fireman had called me, and we often do say when people do call when they're looking to buy something, have you checked if it's on state contract? If something's on state contract, yes, you can just go buy it. There's procedures to follow. We're going to go over them, but that is not splitting. That is an alternative to the public bid law that is allowed by the law. Okay. Police department needs fuel for patrol vehicles. Gas prices always fluctuate. They know they need, one tank costs $60. So they can easily spend more than $60,000 in a year. How do you purchase gas? Can you even bid this out? Well, I see the popular questions. I think it was if the listeners are not enthusiastic, it's the designer's fault. It's not y'all's fault. I didn't give good questions, I suppose. But the AG, the Attorney General, has said for items like fuel that have volatile pricing, you need to bid them out on what's called a price index. And how you determine it's not really the low bidder, but who's the most, you take in considerations for like how much discounts you're going to get as to show who's the most competitive bidder. Okay? I think we got one more of these. And look, I got some more in public works too, so y'all have to suffer through those too. All right. All right. So police chief, needs to purchase new cameras for the police department. The cameras they currently have are the Nikon brand, and the cameras he's got to have got to be compatible with those cameras. The representative from Nikon says he is the sole source and he's the only person who can give him compatible cameras. Can the police chief purchase the cameras from the Nikon representative as the sole source? Okay, first of all, let's clarify something. Sole source is something that's in the state procurement code. It's not in the public bid law. So if you were going to buy something sole source, you have got to adopt, your entity would have to adopt the procurement code for that purchase. You'd have to adopt the sole source provisions to even do a purchase as sole source. And actually, practically nowadays, just in all practical terms, to be honest with you, there's no such thing as sole source anymore. Okay? You can go online and you can take 10 minutes on Google and you will find several different places where you can buy those cameras. Okay? Secondly, public bid law, you can use a brand name to demonstrate the type of camera, the type of equipment or something you're looking for, John Deere, Nikon, whatever it is, but you've got to have those specs written out. And any acceptable alternative that meets those specs, you have to accept if that is in fact the low bidder. You cannot demand that it has to be a Nikon camera or a John Deere tractor. It's got to meet your specs. It's got to be compatible. So when he puts the specs out to be compatible with the system that he's already got in the police department, but it does not have to be, you cannot demand that it only be a Nikon camera. Okay? Functional equivalent is what the term is in the law. So any questions so far? Okay, we have on our website, lla.la.gov, under resources, legal FAQs, we have what we call flow charts. We have one for all the public bid things. And this is a really handy thing, and this would be something really good for when you go and write your manual on how you're going to do procurement to have in there. We have got all the different, oops, I'm messing up here. We've got all the different levels here. We recommend even something less than $1,000 that you call around and see what the prices are, 3 verbal quotes, because I know people like to have petty cash, right? They just go out and buy something, it's $100. We think you should still, be mindful of your fiscal responsibility.
And Angela,
Yes.
Are there any exceptions to the bid law if you buy off of a group contract?
Well, we're going to talk about that. Only there is an exception for hospitals, and there's an exception for school boards, for schools to buy off of group purchasing type arrangements. There is no exception for anyone else. Often, though, these group contracts, especially if they're national in nature, may be adopted by the state, and so then they will therefore be on state contract. But just if the sales guy comes to you and tells you how he's got this group, he's from Texas, and this great group co-op purchasing thing, and you can get the prices really cheap, you need to stop. Unless it's one of those for the hospitals or schools, you need to stop, say to him, let me take the name. Then you're going to go on the Office of State Procurement, as Patrick's going to show you, and you're going to look up and see if that contract is on the state Office of State Procurement, because then it'll be on state contract. In general, though, no. Okay? So then, we've got the different levels. So less than $1,000, like I said, we recommend you at least call around, get verbal quotes. $1,000 to $29,999, obtain 3 written or electronic quotes. $30,000 to $60,000, mandatory that you get 3 documented quotes. You have to have a written confirmation to accept the offer. You have to, if selecting other than the lowest quote, written documentation why you're not selecting the lowest quote. Then we've got all the steps here on this flow chart when you have to go out for bid. First advertisement, at least 15 days before opening of the bids. May not occur on a Saturday, Sunday, or holiday, that advertisement. 2 times more advertisement, at least once a week in a newspaper in the locality. Does not have to be your official journal. If it's your official journal, that's giving you the problems with the once a week, by the way. And may be published electronically as well. Plans and specifications of the bid have to be available at the time of the first advertisement and up until 24 hours until you open the bid. So, and then delivery of the sealed bids, hand delivery or electronic, may not accept or take bids submitted on a United States Postal Service designated holiday. Oops. And then finally, on the bottom, if all qualifications have been met, contract is awarded to the lowest responsible bidder through an execution of the contract or initiation of the purchase order. If you reject all the bids, you may reject any bid for just cause, any and all bids for just cause. If it's somebody because it's non-responsible, you have to go through the due process hearing. So like I said, this is a really good tool for you to have in your offices for buying things for materials and supplies. We also recommend, and it depends on what kind of purchase, definitely for public works, as we'll go over, mandatory bid conferences. We recommend that, and for sure you should have them for public works. A mandatory bid conference is anybody who wants to bid has to come to this conference. They can ask all the questions they want on that bid. You would post all the questions somewhere so everybody would have the ability to see your answers, and only people who attend that bid conference are allowed to bid when it's time to bid. That would be part of the procedures. Okay, ready to move on to Public Works? Yes. You had to start the whole process again. Yes, you do have to start, but there's no like, okay, with the hearing, you've got to give them that 5 days to go to court, okay? But if it's because you didn't have the money, it turned out all the bids came up higher and you've got to go and readjust your budget and reappropriate the fund. So whatever time that takes, but there's nothing in the law that says you have to wait 10 days or something before you start the bid process again. Okay? Yes. Well, you know, you can't go online and find somebody's price listing online. I would try to get 3 documented quotes. And if that means Googling it and going online and downloading that page from that website, I would do that rather than, I would make a note though, for sure. I called so-and-so, he didn't have it, he didn't want to offer me it. I would note that so people know what happened. In case anybody questions you, why did you Google it instead? Why didn't you go to this guy? I would notate that, but I would get the 3 quotes as the best that I could. Yes. I'm sorry. The question was, The question was, what if you go to somebody trying to get your 3 quotes and people are telling you, no, I'm not going to quote. I don't want to sell to you, basically. Maybe they don't have it or something like that. I would note that in the file. Yes. Well, once you start the process, you started the process. And the process, the question is, what if you went out for bid, right? You started the process, and now you find it cheaper on Amazon. Well, the law is, if it's over $60,000, you've got to publicly bid it. And once you start that process, you have to continue the process. You can't, you could cancel the bid. You could do that, but I don't see how you get out of bidding it out, because if you're going out for bid, it's $60,000. Now, something I can tell you, you can always go out to bid even if it's under the threshold. So if it's a case like that, say it was $40,000, okay, your reasonable estimate, and you decided to go, or $50,000, you're like, you know what, I'm gonna go out to bid on this, it's better, more transparent, more fair process, and then you so you went out to bid under the threshold, you didn't have to go out to bid, and you found it cheaper on Amazon, I would cancel the bid. Then you could go buy it if it's under the $60,000, if you were bidding under the threshold, which you can always do. You can always do more than what's required to be open and transparent with the people's money, right? Are you satisfied with that answer? You don't like it, but yeah. Because if it's over 60, it's got to be the bid process. Yes. I'm sorry. Yeah. Yes. We're going to go, we have a whole section on piggybacking. Don't worry. That's everybody's favorite is piggybacking. It'll come right after public works. He asked if I could talk about piggybacking. Yes. What if you find it cheaper on the state contract? Well, before you go out to bid, I honestly, and that could be part of your manual, your steps. When you're going to buy something, check state contract. If your reasonable estimate is going to be 60, if your estimate comes in that this purchase is going to require being let out of bid, always check state contract first. That could be part of your manual. Well, this is going to depend on, you don't have to buy off the state contract, okay? That is an optional thing that you can do. She's asking me, what if something's on state contract at a certain price and then you find it cheaper somewhere else? Using the state contract is just a convenience alternative for you to use so you don't have to go out to bid, right? So it is a lot less paperwork. You don't have to advertise. You can do this, you can purchase off the state contract. So it's optional. You're not required to. So anytime if you find something cheaper than it is on state contract, I would obviously go and buy it at the cheaper place if that's what you choose to do. If it's over $60,000, you will have to go to bid and make sure you go to that vendor and tell them, hey, I'm going out to bid on this and I want you to put a bid in, right? If it's under the $60,000, then obviously, and state contract has it for 40, that guy has it for 38, you go buy it from 38. You have to choose and take steps to purchase off the state contract, okay? Yes, sorry.
Yeah, quick question. Does the cost per unit matter in this case? Because I know a lot of times when you're tagging inventory over 5,000, and I saw the respirator as an example,
Yeah.
like it could be considered a part of something else outside of material and supplies, like.
Well, she's saying is the cost per unit matter for whether it's materials and supply for the public bid law? Not really, as in that kind of sense. There's no limit. The thresholds on the public bid law for materials and supplies are that 30,000, 60,000. Okay, so for how you keep track of your inventory of how you're going to categorize it, that's a different question, and that might even just be procedural for your office. Okay.
Angela, I have another online question.
Yes.
If the winning bidder comes after everything's gone through and says that the inflation has hit and prices are higher and he has to charge more, what is your recourse with that?
Okay, public bid's not a negotiation, all right? Public bid is you're following the recipe, and when he's signed that contract, and that's what, now, can he withdraw? There should be some, yes, that's why you have bond. Well, materials and supplies, I don't think they do bond. Public works, they do bonds. When he signs that contract, and that's the price of steel, that's what he's got to give you that price of steel at. That's why you also need to say, if he's going to default on that, you've got a good, your attorneys have crafted a good contract with a good default provisions in there to where you get some recovery back for that inconvenience on that. And again, if it's a public work contract, there will be a bond in there for a performance bond on a public works contract, but he is stuck with the price. Now, there can be bid specs where if you allow it for an escalation clause in the bid, that can be allowable, and that would be in your contract, because your contract should mirror exactly what your specs are, so that what you bid for and what you're signing that contract is the exact same thing, right? So you can allow escalation clauses, but it needs to be in the contract. And if it's not, he's stuck. He's got to deliver to what he said he would, or default. And then default provisions of your contract come in, okay? That's why it's very careful to draft your contract correctly, draft your specs correctly, draft your contract correctly, and monitor what's going on. Are you getting what you paid for? That's a very important step that's often overlooked in the public bid process, the monitoring part of it, okay? So public work is building and renovation. Unlike materials and supply, this is not things you can just pick up and move across the room. They're attached to the ground, they're attached to the building to such an extent that it would be serious construction to take it out. A chandelier, light fixtures, not really public work, But the HVAC system that's all tied in with all the vents and everything else, and to take it all out would be major renovation, major construction, that's Public Works, okay? The threshold is $250,000. Under that, you're supposed to use the prudent business person standard, again, Article 7, Section 14 of the Constitution. People ask a lot. So we've got a job, Public Works, it's $100,000. Can we use our own people? Yes, you may. That's the answer. But did your calculation, when you got your reasonable estimate for $100,000, include the labor? What you have to plan to do your reasonable estimate of how much this Public Works is going to cost includes labor. It includes the materials and supplies. So if that, including the labor, it still comes in under that $250,000 threshold, you may use your own people to do the job. Then as you go out to buy the materials and supplies, public entity, you have to use the public bid law to purchase those materials and supplies. Also, something to keep in mind, if you're using your own people, there may be some hidden costs in there with like workers' comp and the fact that they're not doing their regular job. They'll be working on this project, so that's something to consider. It doesn't go into your calculation of what the job cost is, but that's something to consider of whether you want to do this, with your own people. We recommend, if it is under, when I say we, I'm talking about the auditor's office, if it is under $250,000 threshold, that you should get at least 3 quotes to see if, you could technically, under the public bid law, $250,000, the job's under $250,000, contractor you've worked with before, he's always done a good job for the city, you could just go out and hire him. Right? We recommend request for proposal process that would be advertised, and you get different, or at least a quotes process from different contractors to see if you're going to get the best price. Okay. With the Public Works, over $250,000, that kicks in the advertisement. The first advertisement has to be at least 25 days before the bid opening. Cannot occur on Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday. You can, electronic bidding, you have to allow for electronic bidding, and no changes within 72 hours of the opening. If you do, you have to extend the bid opening, and you have to extend it for 1 week. There is a law right now that's going to raise that threshold. There's a bill that was introduced that's going to raise that threshold to $1 million. I don't know how well it's going to do, but let's see. So again, your amount, I think I've already talked about your preliminary step. You've got to see what the cost is going to be. You've got to include labor in that cost. For advertising, again, 25 days, the first advertisement before the bid, at least 25 days before the bid opening. You've got to make sure with the newspapers the way they are today, you plan that out, get your calendars out. How are you going to receive and opening the bids? It's going to all be electronic, which you can allow. Your selection of the lowest responsive and responsible bidder. They've got a different word here now. What's responsive mean? Well, the public bid law for Public Works is, and they've got all these forms that you have to fill out. The contractor's license has got to be on the envelope. There's a whole bunch of rules when you're doing a Public Works project, over $250,000. And a responsive person is someone who basically filled out all their documentation correctly. If they did not fill out their documentation correctly, they are non-responsive, and you have to reject them. The Attorney General's opinions, a contractor did not put his license on the bid envelope as required by the public bid law. The Attorney General told that entity, you have got to reject that bid. Okay, so that's how strict the Public Works is. And again, contract formation, I think we talked about that. Mirror your bid specs, make sure you've got all that stuff to protect you. Now, I'm not going to go over this again, but it is basically the same due process hearing when someone's non-responsible, right? When someone's not a responsible party. Now, for non-responsive, you still got to give them some due process. You've got to give them notice. Listen, you didn't put your contractor's license. I've got to reject you. It's not as much of a rigmarole as the non-responsible person that you don't want because he's a shady character, he's done all kinds of messed up work before, he leaves the job in the middle of it, leaves, the entity's holding the bag. This person, you have got to give that same informal hearing 5 days after. No sooner than 5 days after, you have to have the informal hearing. No later than 5 days after the hearing, you have to have the written notice to him, and then you can't award the contract for 5 days after that. And he has the chance to go and run to the court and get an injunction, right? I won't go over, like I said, I'm not going to go over every single word here again. Now, there are also timelines for public works of when you have to sign the contract. You have got to award the contract at least 45 days after bid opening. That's another timeline you've got. You and the apparent low bidder can agree to extend that by 30-day increments. You're supposed to execute the contract 60 days after awarding the contract. So, right, you got 45 days after bid openings to award it. You can agree with the apparent low bidder to extend that by 30. But after you have awarded it, you now have 60 calendar days to sign the contract. Personally, I think drafting that contract should not be too difficult for your attorney because it's going to be a mirror of your bid specs, right? And that's barring any injunctions or something like that the other guy who lost out brings against you. Because I'm going to tell you, the guy that's going to know everything in that bid, those bid specs better than you, is the guy who lost, the second low bidder, right? And he's going to be looking for a reason why he should have gotten that contract, not the guy you awarded it to. So you got to be very careful with that. Make sure you do cross your I's and dot your T's when it comes to the public bid law. Now, issues with public works contracts, splitting jobs. You can't split the jobs. You cannot make a job that's a $500,000 job into $200,000, $200,000, $100,000 jobs. You cannot break it up to avoid bidding it out. No out-of-hand disqualifications, meaning you have to do the due process. Follow your bid specs. Change orders, which we're going to talk about, must be within the contract scope, and you may have to record them. Be precise and monitor what's going on at every step. And there is a mandatory bid form that must be used. There's the link for it. Okay? Okay. Change orders. Change order is a modification to the contract that somehow alters or deviates what was originally bid out for some reason or another. Could be a deletion of the work, revision of the work, an addition of work, right? Now, outside the scope of the contract means the change order, the nature of the change order is something that's going to be constructed or done that's not part of the integral job or the project objective. So if you bid out the new city hall, and then you realize, you know what, we really need a garage for the public to park in, so this contractor is doing good. That would be a change order outside the scope of the contract. Okay? That's not what the job was. The job that was bid out was city hall. No garage was even mentioned. You can nowadays bid jobs if you're worried about the funding. You can do bid alternatives. You can have a project where you say city hall and a garage, right? And have the bidders bid out alternatively, basically 2 bids, and you got the specs for all of them. But you can't get halfway through the city hall, someone realizes, we really need a parking garage. Why don't we get this contractor? He's doing such a good job. Do a change order? No, you can't do a change order, in my opinion, on that. That's outside the scope of the contract. Okay? Within the scope means the change order doesn't really alter the nature of things being constructed, and it is an integral part of the project. Say the project was bid out for a certain type of flooring, this certain type of flooring is not available, you need to go with something else, or you want to change the paint color, some interior walls, you've decided that could be within the scope. It's the same building. You're just having some revisions to the project in that way, okay? With change orders, though, if there's some rules about recording them. If it adds 10% or more of the original contract amount, and it's at least $10,000, or if you've got several little change orders that in an aggregate amount to 20% or more of the original contract, and they add up to $10,000 at least, they have to be recorded by the public entity in the office of the recorder of mortgages in the parish where the work is done. Okay? If you did not record the original contract, when you record the change orders, you're going to have to record the original contract as well. Okay? Rejection of bids. All bids can be rejected for just cause. You don't have the funds sufficient. You thought this job was going to come in at $500,000. All the bids are coming in at $600,000. That's another reason to stop yourself and go back and figure out why your estimate was so much lower than the bids you're getting before you decide to re-let that out. There was a substantial change by the public entity. You bid out the city hall. Right before you open the bids, you realize you need that garage too. You cancel all the bids. That's just cause. A determination by the entity not to build whatever it is within that same within the next 12 months of the date of the opening, or a disqualification of the public entity by all the bidders. Half the people were non-responsive. The other two guys you disqualified as non-responsible, right? And that was, you had, 6 bidders. And so now they're all gone. So that's you rejecting all the bids. Okay? That's the case. Here's some Attorney General's opinions that go over these kind of things. That first one is that guy that didn't fill in, left some spaces blank when the instructions said don't leave any blank spaces. This other one is about rejecting potential bidders for lack of responsibility, but not debar them automatically. You have to follow the process you have to follow the due process procedures. A bidder who includes an annotation in his bid for an escalation of price, a 3.5% escalation, when the bid document said clearly that the prices and terms and conditions were all to remain unchanged during the term, was a non-responsive bidder. Okay? Design build. They are allowed in specific cases in the law. In general, though, with your public works process, you do not do design build. You follow the public works procedures. You cannot add things in there that are not part of the public bid law. This is an Attorney General opinion on that. Absent legal authority this was the city of New Orleans. They wanted to make a local hiring preference you had to live in the parish of Orleans to bid on their projects. The Attorney General said, no, you cannot put a local hiring preference in your public works project bids. And you have got to use that mandatory bid bid form. We're going to take a break, I think, right after our little scenarios. So here's scenario 1. School district needs to replace the roofs on all 10 of the school buildings in the district. Cost for each building is $30,000. Do they have to let that out for bid? Yes or no? Yes, because it's the same thing, right? You're doing the same type of work. Yes, they're different buildings. I would treat this as all one project, that's $300,000. Now, what if the district only had funding to do half of them? Now, and they got to wait to the next fiscal year to do the other half. That's actually an Attorney General opinion. The Attorney General said when you have a financial reason, you don't have the money to do all the work now, that is not improper splitting. But you want to make sure you document that and make sure that's actually the case, that you don't have the money this year to do all 10, so we'll do 5 this year, 5 next year. You could also do a bid and do it in phases. Bid out the job for all 10 roofs. Phase 1, these 5 buildings. Phase 2, that 5 building. That's an option that you could do, okay? Parish properly let out bid for street repair project, and the winning contractor is doing a great job. The parish would like to do a change order to add more streets to be repaired by this contractor. Can they do that? This is going to depend on what the bid specs say, right? This is going to depend on what is in that project. If the bid specs were, and what streets are going to be added, if the repair project was for a certain geographical area, okay, you're going to do 10 streets in this geographical area that we're going to point out to you. That's what the bid spec said. And now you want to add 5 more streets in that same geographical area, that could be a legitimate change order. It's within the project, right? But if it's across town in a different geographical area with the bid specs, then that would be outside the scope of the contract. Okay? Now, the city wants to do major renovations of City Hall. The cost of all the repairs will come in under $250,000. Can they use their own workers for the renovations? Yes. Can the city choose to bid out the project even though it is under the threshold? Yes, they may. You can always choose to bid it out. Now, what if it's just repainting a room, like preventative stuff? You got to paint the outside of City Hall because, you know, the weather, it's something like that. It's going to damage the building if you don't. Routine maintenance is a different type of project than public works. Routine maintenance is it's actually considered services, and you can do those contracts. We would recommend doing RFP, which we'll talk about for them. They are different from the public works, so you've got to also see what you're doing. You got to use your common sense. A lot of this. Another thing I want to bring out is very fact specific. Is it routine maintenance or is it a repair? Repair would be a public work. Routine maintenance would be not a public work that you don't have to bid that out. Okay? Demolition, there's a case out there. The Attorney General, when you're demolishing something, is that a public work? Does that need to be bid out under the public bid law? Attorney General opinion saying no, it's not. A case in the Fourth Circuit called Concrete Busters says it is. So we would recommend that you bid it out since we got an actual court case from the Fourth Circuit now. Definitely if you're in Orleans or Jefferson, that's where the Fourth Circuit has jurisdiction, you want to bid it out. As a precaution, I would go with the court case and say demolition is a public work. We also have a very detailed outline here of all the steps for the public bid, every step that you need to do. I guess maybe for time-wise, how are we? We're at about an hour right now. Maybe I won't go through every little step of it like I did the last time. But again, what do you do if $250,000 are left? We've got it right there for you. How do you hold the due process hearing to disqualify somebody? It's right there on the chart for you. The thresholds for if it is $250,000 or more, how you have to advertise, how you have to take the bids, how you can determine if all the qualifications have been met. Here we do have the rejection of bids, and we have the bid conference. It's listed on there as optional, the pre-bid conference. We think it should be mandatory, always, especially with public works, do that mandatory pre-bid conference so these people that want to bid on your job have to attend that, and only those who attend are allowed to bid. That we just find that to be a very good practice, a very helpful practice, and really weeds out anybody who might be non-responsible from even bidding in the first place, right? Now, I was going to go over emergencies, or should we're going to go ahead and take our break. Let me go here. I was going to give you 5 minutes, feeling generous. I'm going to give you 10 minutes, and we'll come back and we'll do emergencies, okay? So I think it's been a little more than 10 minutes, so let's go ahead and get started now, if that's okay with everyone. I want to point out 2 things that came to my attention during the break. When I was talking about buying your paper, that was just an example I gave. You should be estimating all like items. So like all your office supplies, your paper, your pens, your paper clips that you're using in the year, that should go together. If you're a recreation district, it was pointed out to me, the auditors want to see all your equipment, your baseballs, your footballs, your stuff like that, bid out as estimated of what you use in a year. Okay, so it is like items that you would be bidding out on those types of requirements contracts. Okay, in EMT, you know, if you're buying medical supplies like gauzes and stuff like that, that would be a like item, those medical type supplies to estimate for the entire year, okay? So I just want to clarify on that. Another thing I want to clarify is that, I just didn't say it. Those charts that we make, that we have available on the materials and supply flow chart, the Public Works flow chart, we update those. It's real tiny on the bottom, but that one says 9/2023. We updated it after last year's session. We will update it again after this year's session. So always around August, September of each year, it'll be updated with the most current law, just so you can know. So you always check back on that. Now we're going to talk about some exceptions to the public bid law. The first or alternatives. There's emergency and extreme emergency exception. They are defined in the law at in Title 38, 2212P 1 and 2, emergency and an extreme emergency, which basically kind of suspends the public bid law to deal with the emergency. Now, depending on what type of emergency it is, in a regular emergency, you have time. It's an unforeseen mischance bringing with it destruction or injury of life or property, or the imminent threat of such destruction or injury. And it could also be you've got a judicial order from the court that has got to be done within a certain time limit, and so there's no time to go out for the public bid process, okay? This emergency allows you to actually meet and certify that there's an emergency, and you would publish notice of that certification within 10 days of the journal. Then you have an extreme emergency, which is a catastrophic event which causes the loss of the ability to obtain a quorum for your governing authority to meet to certify the emergency prior to making the expenditure. So, or acquire whatever materials and supplies it is. So, the roof has been blown off from the hurricane, water is pouring in. You do not have to have the meeting or go out to public bid to purchase that tarp to cover the roof. You're going to purchase the tarp to save the lives and property in that building on City Hall or the hospital or whatever the case may be, right? Also, you want to do it because you're going to have to mitigate losses for your insurance. So even though that tarp is $150,000, which is well over the $60,000 limit for materials and supplies, the extreme emergency is going to allow you to just go out and buy it. And then you certify the notice of the emergency within, as soon as practicable, is what the law says. You're going to keep written documentation of everything you do, of every expenditure you made. Were you even able to get quotes? If you were, write down the names of the people you got quotes from and the prices. How much you agreed to, who you actually hired, how much they agreed to give you those materials and supplies for that tarp. Okay? It's common sense a little bit. If people are actually going to die, property's actually going to get destroyed, and it's such a catastrophe, you can't even meet to have the meeting to certify it, that's definitely an extreme emergency. But keep in mind, they don't last forever. Not even a regular emergency. COVID emergency lasted for a long time because we kept getting governor's declarations of an emergency for like more than a year. But you got to go back to normal and follow your procedures at some time, right? And this is a good Attorney General opinion, 20-0118, where he goes through all the processes for both an emergency and an extreme emergency for buying things, okay? Now, we already took our 5. Now we've got some other alternatives. I mean, emergency is really an exception to the public bid, and here's some other alternatives, and we'll go over each one of them. You can, and I won't read them now here, but I'll go through them in the slides as we go through. But keep in mind when we talk about all of these alternatives to the public bid, if you are seeking federal reimbursement for things, these alternatives may not be acceptable for federal reimbursement. Some of them, because of the lack of competition, might not be acceptable. For example, the piggybacking is one I can think of. The cooperative purchasing might not be acceptable for federal reimbursement because as Patrick's going to go over with you, the federal government always wants to see competition for every purchase. Okay, purchasing surplus property from another public entity. That 33-1321 authorizes political subdivisions of the state of Louisiana to sell surplus movable property to another political subdivision of the state without public auction or public bid process. Federal government as well, you can buy from their surplus property from the federal government. So if you're going to do this, so town A has an extra tractor, they don't need it anymore, they surplus it, they can just sell it to town B without going through the auction that would normally be required in surplus property, and town B can buy it without going out for bid on it, okay? You do want to, it's got to be in writing, not you want to, you have to enter into a written cooperative endeavor agreement with that. The two towns will be going into a written cooperative endeavor agreement. We do have a sample on our website of a cooperative endeavor agreement. It's kind of all encompassing. It might not be, you know, you don't have to use all parts of it, but we have a sample for you, and you have to ensure that fair market value is being exchanged, because you can't sell, Article 7, Section 14, Town A can't get less than fair market value for its surplus property. So we got to ensure that. Now, if you're entering in a cooperative endeavor agreement, a question we get, does it have to be money always? Between two cities, you could also exchange services that are worth that same fair market, like some money and some services that equal the fair market value. But that's the purpose of the CEA, it's Cooperative Endeavor Agreement. It's going to outline exactly what the value is that is being exchanged for that tractor, okay? This is also different from, there is a provision, I just want to point this out, Article 7, Section 14B14 allows one political subdivision to lend the use of equipment to another political subdivision of the state. That's the use. The Attorney General has an opinion on it that's very clear. It is not the case where the city is buying a tractor and basically giving it to the levy district to use, okay? That's not allowed. That would be an improper donation, okay? If they're just using it for a project, and that should also be in writing there, so we're going to lend it to you for this amount of time, you're going to take over, you know, any claims for damages and stuff like that should probably be in that writing, but it's for the use for this specific project, and then it comes back to the city, okay? Any questions? Okay. Also, there's an exception for emergency equipment. This is for like fire trucks and police, emergency response vehicles and fire response vehicles. If they're used and they're $100,000 or less, you can use this exception to the public bid law. Now, there's like certain vehicles that are not included in this law. Sedans, for example, are not included in this law, but that is one exception you can use for fire and emergency response vehicles used under $100,000. Piggybacking, which everybody loves. There's two different ways to piggyback. The local services law way, which is I call it the Attorney General opinion way, because the Attorney General created this through opinions using the local services law. This is only for local political subdivisions. The state cannot use it. State agencies cannot use it. Then they have, a couple years back, the legislature enacted 38321.1, and that's for everybody. Local political subdivisions, state agencies, everybody can use that second way. So who you are can determine which one you use. I think here we're all local governments. So you, the Attorney General has said, have a choice of which one you want to use. You got to stick with the one you're using though, right? I have up there a little chart. They're very similar. In both cases, the original person who has the contract, Town A, has let out for bid and bought some tractors, okay? You want that same exact tractor in your town. So do you have to bid it out, or can you piggyback off the contract that Town A did? You can piggyback. Town A has got to have used the public bid law properly to get that purchase, and they have to certify that. So that's same in both of them. The
Angela-
vendor has got to agree. Both of them. The vendor's got to be willing to sell it to you. Yes. Yes. Yes.
Can you repeat the question, please?
Local entities include school boards. Yes, they do. School boards are local political subdivisions.
Angela, I have an online question
Yes.
too. If you purchase something with a federal grant and then want to donate it to another municipality, do you have to go through the surplus?
Listen, anything you buy with a federal grant, you need to check your grant rules. 100%. I will never say that. They have specific ways of disposing of property in your federal grant. Sometimes they may be, you can have it and we don't care, but you need to certify and make sure that's the case. Anything you're dealing with, that whoever the funding agency was, if it was HUD, if it was U.S. Treasury, which was American Rescue Plan, whatever that funding agency was that you got that grant from, you need to check your grant documents. I would never dispose of any federal property, anything purchased with federal funds before I really checked and made sure of that, okay? Because sometimes their rules will say if you're going to surplus it, no longer need it, you got to return the money back to the funding agency. That could be in your grant documents, okay? It only applies to materials and supplies. You cannot piggyback off of, a public works project that was let out for bid. It's got to be materials and supplies, and it has to be the exact same thing. It's got to be the exact same tractor. Could it maybe be a different color? They got white ones. The vendor says, yeah, I'm willing to give it to you, but I only have green left. That would be okay, but the specs have got to be the same. That's for both of them. Now, where it starts getting a little different, local services law, the statutory piggybacking method will allow you to buy 2 times what was purchased under the original contract. So maybe Town A got 1 tractor, you could buy 2. The local government service law, there's no limit. The price under local government service law is the same or lower from that same vendor. Under the statutory piggybacking way, it's got to be the exact same price. So those are where the little differences come in, but the biggest difference is right there in the middle, the timing. The statutory way, piggybacking way, says 1 year from the opening of bids. You have to piggyback off of that contract. The Attorney General Local Government Services way says the contract is still fresh or viable, and there's debate on what that means. If it is a contract for a tractor and that tractor has been delivered, is the contract over? I think maybe yes it is. It's no longer viable, right? If it's one of those requirements contracts where you're purchasing all the time throughout the year, that is definitely still viable because you're in the same fiscal year, right? So that would still be viable, I would think. But I do say there could be some room for different attorneys, because we all have different opinions, that would argue otherwise on what viable means. And the Attorney General has not been exactly clear on that. Okay, some examples. This is that Attorney General opinion number 170152 that says locals can use either one, and he goes through, and at the time it was a man. I got to start saying she now. I'm not used to that, right? But at the time, it was Attorney General Landry, and he lists out the different ways to purchase that we've just gone over. And again, you cannot piggyback off of a national cooperative purchasing organization that has not been competitively bid by another Louisiana public entity. And again, for those wondering about national cooperatives, you cannot make a direct purchase from a National Joint Powers Alliance. That was the name of that company contract, unless that contract was adopted by the Office of State Procurement and now is a state contract. And the last one, piggybacking is not allowed on public works projects. An alternative to public bid, sometimes you buy contracts. I've already told you that services are not subject to the public bid law. So if you're buying services, you don't have to bid them out. Sometimes contracts are mixed. So you're buying food and you're hiring the person, like if you're running a cafeteria, for example, in a jail, because a school would be, let's not leave schools out of it. You're buying food in a jail and you're hiring the person to make the food, right? What are you buying? You're buying services, the person's cooking services, and you're buying food. So that's a mixed contract where you're buying materials and supplies and services. The Attorney General has said in the past that when you're doing those kind of purchases to determine whether it's a services contract or a materials and supplies contract, you have to see what is the biggest thing that you're buying. What's the real reason for that contract? Probably the food in that case, so it's a materials and supply contract that's going to be bid out if it's over the $60,000 limit. Well, this was coming up so often with electronic equipment, the legislature enacted this special law for any telecommunications and video surveillance equipment and services. A lot of times you're buying something electronic, but you're also buying the IT services that go along with it or the software that goes along with it to run it, right? So it's a mixed contract all the time. So you can bid those out if the main thing is the equipment you're buying, or you can use this alternative, which is an RFP process, a request for proposal type of contract. The advantage of this is you put out in your specs what you want, and you're also going to be putting out your criteria of how you're going to judge who's the most acceptable bidder. You're going to have a committee that reviews all the proposals, and we'll go over all the timelines for this law. And you select not the lowest price, but the one that's most advantageous to your entity. That's what the criteria for judging is. You're going to have like a rubrics that's along with your proposal of price is, 45% of the consideration. Compatibility, et cetera, and maintenance is 30%. Like you're going to list out what your considerations are, and you're going to evaluate all the proposals based on that to select the most advantageous one. Before we get, though, into the specifics with this RFP process, I want to point out that there has been a law recently passed. It's right up there on the slide in red. There's a prohibition against certain projects, pieces of equipment, electronic equipment, that is made by certain companies, Huawei and some other Chinese companies, that we are not allowed to have in the electronics that you buy. And a way that, so that prohibition, what that means for you, because how are you supposed to know? You have got to get the vendor to sign an affidavit that none of those forbidden, prohibited companies that manufacture these types of things that are like inside the computer, inside this electronic equipment, is in this. We have created a vendor template, like a sample affidavit for you to use. It's on the LLA's website. So whenever you're making any purchases of telecommunications or electronics, whether you're doing it under public bid law or under this exception, needs to have that affidavit that those types of products were not used in the manufacturing of that equipment. And by the way, I know a lot of water meters are now electronic. Water meters would fall under this, electronic water meters would fall under this law, to where you could use this RFP process. And you need to get that vendor affidavit too, that those forbidden equipment is not in there. We have a flow chart for this alternative for the public bid law. So the RFP process, you're going to give your public notice at least 30 days prior to the date of the schedule of opening the RFPs, and you give it to the general public via available electronic media. You have to give written notice of the RFP mailed to all persons or corporations that you believe would be in a position to furnish the equipment that you're looking for and the services. Now, the RFP has to indicate the relative importance of price and other evaluation factors. It has to clearly define the tasks to be performed under the contract, list the functional specifications, explain the criteria that will be used in evaluating the proposals, and the time frames which in the work is to be completed. Then you come to the award. Your award is made to the responsible offer whose proposal is determined in writing by the governing authority to be the most advantageous, considering both price and your other factors, right? Then you're going to have, you can reject proposals if it's in your best, if the governing authority deems it to be in the best interest to reject all the proposals. And your contract requirements here, your written proposals everything that's in your RFP must be incorporated into your final contract. Again, I would also say have a mandatory bid conference. It's not mandatory RFP conference in this case to require everybody to come and to ask the questions that they want. You are not, I just want to remind you, this is an optional alternative you can use. You do not have to use this alternative, but it is a really good, convenient alternative for you to use when you're buying this type of equipment, electronics, telecommunication equipment. Any questions? Okay, yes. Is there a criminal penalty? I know there's a fine associated with it. I don't know that there's prison time, actually. I'd have to go back and look at that. I'm sorry about that. But there is a fine. Okay? I don't know that there's jail time or something. And it's definitely, yeah, definitely would be an audit finding if I won't want to say definitely. It could be an audit finding for sure if you don't have that vendor affidavit. Yes. Okay, if you're just buying something and it's under the $60,000 limit, so you're using the regular public bid law, do you have to get that vendor affidavit? Yes, you do. It's for all electronic and telecommunications equipment. Okay? Now, purchasing off-state contract and the ability to use local vendor. When Patrick takes over in a few seconds, we'll have another break again. He's going to go over that in detail, but that is an alternative to the public bid law. Like I've told you, I think we've talked about it a lot. The state has already pre-bid these things, and you're allowed to go and use that contract. You have to follow certain steps to do that. And you can buy that item from that exact item that's on the state contract. You can, under this other law, actually use a local vendor that's close by to you, as long as it's the same equipment, but Patrick's going to go over that with you thoroughly. Same kind of rules apply with the GSA, which is the Federal General Services Administration. It's the federal government's contract list. Now, there are rules with that as well that Patrick's going to go over. It can't be on state contract, or it can't be cheaper on state contract. It's got to be like cheaper on the GSA in order for you to do it. Now, contracts for services, we've kind of talked about. They're not under the public bid law, which means when you're going out and you're buying somebody to do hiring somebody to do lawn maintenance services for your town, you don't have to bid that work out. Or for attorneys, for example, you don't have to bid that out. There are certain things, though, that the law in Louisiana requires you to do an RFQ process, certain services, when you're doing hiring architectural engineer and other professional services. They want you to do it based on competence and qualifications for a fair and reasonable price. And you must use an RFQ process when you're hiring architects, engineers, landscape architects, for public works projects. You have to use an RFQ process, and that's not correct? You have to have the board involved. Well, you have to make sure you're not going by lowest price. You want the best qualified for these jobs. So we would recommend, I've written down there, you should use an RFQ process for these types of services to make sure you're getting the best qualified person. So maybe that's my mistake in my reading. You should use an RFQ process for these types of services when you're doing a public works project to make sure you get a guy. Somebody can be an architect. He has no experiences with this type of building that you're building. You don't want to just hire that person. That's why I'm saying you should use an RFQ process for those. Now, people ask, they call and ask, is there a template for the RFPs, for the request for proposals, request for qualifications, a little bit different. how do I do an RFP template? Well, you could use the timelines that we just went over with the telecommunications flowchart. You could basically use that process for hiring other people through an RFP process. That's like a good guideline for you to create. Also, the Division of Administration on this page has some sample templates. Now, they are for the state government. They'll have agency and stuff like that. You'll have to customize them, but you could use those sample templates for RFPs. So what are examples of common services that you get that would be considered a professional service and therefore exempt under the public bid law? So you don't have to bid them out, but we would recommend an RFP for them, okay? Operating and maintenance municipal water and sewer system is a contract for service. So if you want to hire an operator for your town's sewer system, you can do that with you. That's considered a service. We would recommend doing an RFP process or an RFQ process for hiring that person. Municipal and parish trash collection, that is considered a service. Doesn't have to be publicly bid unless you're giving an exclusive franchise. If you're giving an exclusive franchise, like only one person can pick up the trash in the town, then it has to be publicly bid. Ground maintenance services, removal of fallen trees, weeds, debris collection, that would constitute services. That does not have to be publicly bid, but we recommend an RFP process or an RFQ process for them.
What about,
yes.
Angela, what about group insurance?
Group insurance.
Like health insurance or?
I would do a
life
request for proposals for sure on that. That's a really good way, and make the different insurance agents in the vicinity compete to see who can get you the best prices on your insurance. That would be, yes, it's a service, and I would do it through an RFP for sure on that. So they can have some competition and see what is the best, most advantageous to your town to buy that, because that can be a very hefty price tag with your insurances. Now, you may have in your own city, in your own town, if you have a home rule charter, especially stricter procurement requirements from everything I've said today. They may want you to go out to bid for materials and supply at $20,000. That is up to the governing authority, okay? I can't change that part. I'm just telling you what the public bid law requires. Any other questions? Well, if not, then we can take another 10-minute break, and then Patrick can come on, and he's going to start with buying under from state contract. So 10 minutes. Let's get the time this time. It's 10:26, so 10:36. Be back here.
So what we're going to, as Angela alluded to, before we go into some things with the Office of State Procurement, we're going to talk about a couple alternative methods to the public bid law that are authorized that you'll need to know how to use the Office of State Procurement's website. The first is when we're purchasing off state contracts. This is an exception that's authorized under the public bid law. Basically allows political subdivisions to go purchase from the state Office of State Procurement's websites contracts that they've previously competitively bid and negotiated. The key thing, and as we as an auditors would want to make sure you do, is document. And by documentation, I mean keeping track of the things, because as Angela talked about, the public bid law is a prohibitory law. So when your auditor is looking for when you bought something that was over $60,000, they're looking for that you comply with the laws that would apply when you purchase something that's over $60,000. So if you're using a state contract, you're going to want to make sure you have clear documentation that shows what that contract was that you're using. You don't want to just say, hey, it's on a state contract. You're going to want that contract number. You're going to want to know what exactly is the item under state contract, because the key thing is to use this exception and not bid it out yourself. It needs to be the same identical item. And so sometimes you'll get a vendor who will tell you, oh, this item's under state contract. You don't want to take just their word for it. You want to go and do your own due diligence to make sure what you're buying really is under a state contract and what you're going to try to buy is actually that same item. Now, to kind of complete that circle, you want documentation in your file that what you actually purchased matches up to what's under the state contract. So you're going to want all that information in your contract files. What we recommend as a good way to kind of identify, so if someone years later says, why didn't you bid this out? Either through an ordinance resolution or even just something documented as a motion in your minutes that reflects, we're going to purchase this using the state contract. Some public entities will have, as Angela talked about, as part of their procedures, they go look at the state contracts first when they're going to buy certain things, especially for materials and supplies, because it's just, from an administrative standpoint, it's easier. That doesn't mean you don't still have work and documentation you need to do in doing that. The other exception that basically is kind of the natural evolution of that exception. So you can purchase something that's a state contract. The state Office of State Procurement has a specific vendor or vendors that are their vendors for that contract. However, what the legislature put into play, and Angela alluded to it earlier, there is an additional kind of evolution of that exception that says you can go buy that identical item that's on state contract, but instead of using the state's vendor, you can use a local dealer or vendor in your locale. So what does that really mean? Even when you're using the local vendor, you're still doing it under the auspices of the state's contract. They have the means to add additional options and items on that contract, but it's optional and they have to be the ones to do it. The local, I think you would think of it in your traditional sense. The AG has previously noted it's not defined in law, but if you read it in context, it's the deal in your jurisdiction, in your city limits or adjacent to your city limits, because a lot of times dealers may be on the outskirts of a town. But the key thing is they're not across the state. You're not going to buy something from a dealer in New Orleans when you are in Southwest Louisiana. It needs to be a vendor that's actually local to you. Oh, I thought we had a question. The key thing, though, is under this exception, when you're buying from the local vendor, the AG has noted it has to be the contract price or lower, but there's some additional requirements you have to do when you're going to use that contract. One of the biggest ones is you have to document and send a copy of your purchase order to the Office of State Procurement because they are regulating that. And in some cases, they may use that to add additional vendors to the state contract that may be able to help those state agencies that are in your area. Now, the biggest change that is kind of from the state contract, you're paying what the state contract price is for the options that are under the state contract. When you're using the local vendor, the legislature has authorized them to charge an additional fee for basically delivery, shipping, things of those sorts, in addition to the contract price, which again needs to be at or below the state contract price. It's a percentage, and that percentage changes as you kind of go through the process. So if it's a contract where the price you're buying is up to $10,000, they're allowed to charge an additional up to a 7% fee. So what that means is let's say the state contract price is $8,000, they can charge up to $8,560 because they're allowed to have that additional charge, which needs to be identified on the invoice for that purpose. Once we get up to over 10,000, but not more than 20, that percentage goes down as the price goes up. So if that contract price is 15,000, they can not exceed 15,750. So the percent went down, but they're still allowed to charge that fee. And then of course, anything that's over 20,000, it's a 3%, which means, let's say the contract price is 50,000, it can't exceed 51,500. And again, you want to make sure those are specifically documented on the invoice you get. So the AG back in '96, which is the only time we really have a definitive interpretation of this provision, said that basically lays out the steps you need to follow. And I will note in our FAQ that we post on our website for the public bid law, we actually have a question that specifically addresses when you want to use state contract from a local vendor, and it lays out these steps for you. So if you need it somewhere or you need to share it with someone, that's out there and posted. So again, the key things, just like in anything, you want to show what is the state contract that you're relying on in this case, what is the price, because you want to make sure that that price and those specifications, because you're using that contract, you want to show you're really using the specification and pricing under that contract. Again, delivery prices, those percentages, that's an additional charge, needs to be documented on your invoice. And then finally, a copy of that purchase order has to be furnished to the Office of State Procurement. We're going to make sure as we walk through the Office of State Procurement's website, I'll show you where that information is. And on the slide, it actually has the email address that you would send this information to so that you'll have it, at least specifically if it was a vehicle contract. So the other evolution we have is you can use state contracts to buy without bidding out. The law also allows you to use essentially the federal government's equivalent. The General Services Administration has price lists where they do essentially the same thing the Office of State Procurement does on the state level. They go out and competitively negotiate and bid out contracts for federal agencies. And just as the state allows locals to use it, they also allow for state governments and political subdivisions to use their dealers, their distributors under these contracts. It's important to note there are some restrictions when you're using a GSA price list. The key thing is it cannot be an item that you can get cheaper under state contract. The law, if you think about it in the bigger contents, as we talked about earlier with Article 7, Section 14, it makes sense. If you can get it for a cheaper price, you're kind of obligated to because you're using public dollars. It would be essentially a donation to say, well, we don't want to buy it from the state contract. We're going to use this federal contract even though it costs more. There's really no justification for it. So what the law says is you can't do that. You have to go look and see, is it cheaper under state contract? If it is, you can't use the GSA. So let's say it is not available under state contract or the state contract's way more expensive than the GSA price list. The next requirement is that you have to use a Louisiana licensed dealer or distributor to perfect that sale. That doesn't mean the person has to be located in Louisiana. To be licensed to do business, they can be a car dealership in Houston, but if they're registered with the Secretary of State and have all the proper registrations to sell vehicles within Louisiana, they're going to be a Louisiana licensed dealer or distributor. This kind of goes back to that key Angela was talking about when you're bidding it out, where you're looking for the responsible bidder. You're making sure this is someone who you can actually perfect legally that sale. They can actually sell it to you. So in either case of any of these three exceptions, they're all going to be contingent upon making an initial look to see, is there a cheaper, is this under a state contract? What exactly is on the state contract? Or in the case of GSA, is it cheaper under a state contract? So it kind of behooves us to be familiar with, how do we go find those state contracts? How do we know if it's under a state contract, and where would one even go look to find those? Well, we're going to kind of walk you through where you would find this information on the Office of State Procurement's website. So when you if you go to the Division of Administration, they have a link where you can go to any of the entities that are offices of their office, and you can go to the Office of State Procurement on their website. What we're going to be looking at is going to be under the agency issues as well, to show you what they have. So when we go to their website, at the bottom of the page, you're going to see information on contact information, which is going to be very important for you if you have questions throughout the process, or as you're dealing with a contract, if you want to know, hey, we don't see this under a state contract, but we want to know for sure it's not under a state contract. So the most important contact information you're going to find there is the help desk, because this is going to be either through email or the number will be able to help you determine if the item you're looking for, or at least an equivalent item, is under state contract. Because one of the things you'll see when you look through state contracts, not all state contracts have specific items. In some cases, it may be a catalog contract where it's basically a % off of whatever that vendor sells. And so if you really want to do your due diligence and try to get something on state contract, you're going to want to know and use these experts, because as we'll see, every contract that the Office of State Procurement perfects, there is someone on their staff who is assigned to that contract, and it's basically their liaison with the vendor and the agency who try to use that contract. So on the left-hand side, the thing that's going to be important for us looking here is going to be ECAT, is what they call it. This is basically where you can go search current state contracts. And so this will be where you can basically find anything you're really looking for. When you go to ECAT, it gives you tons of search options. You can search by the vendor, you can search by the contract itself, if you know a contract number and you want to get a copy of that contract. You can also search just by item description. So if you know I'm looking for vehicles, you can go into that third column, put in vehicle just as the category that you're looking for, and hit search, hit find it. When you do it, it's going to give you a list of state contracts. When you're looking at these state contracts, it's going to give you the contract number. It's going to tell you the current description of what that contract is, who the vendor is under that contract. They're also importantly going to tell you when is that contract effective. Because as we found out last October, a lot of the state's vehicle contracts terminated at the end of October. So for a good period of at least a month or so, there were no state contracts that people could use to buy vehicles. And as we were getting questioned day after day, hey, the state contracts have run out on vehicles. What do you do? Bid it out, because there was no state contract to rely on. The contract number it's nice because the way they have it set it up is when you see, let's say in this case, Jerry Lane is the Chevy GM contract for vehicles, statewide contract. If you click on the contract number, it takes you to basically the landing page for that state contract. What's nice is they give you the information for the vendor, as well as who is the Office of State Procurement's contact, their email address, their phone number. So if you have questions about that state contract to know what exactly is under that state contract, you're having trouble looking and it just doesn't make sense, that's a person you can reach out to and get your answers. And more importantly, if you email them, you have an email you can put into your contract file to show you made that question. And if you said, hey, we're looking for this as an under state contract, and they tell you in the email, no, that item is not under state contract, that's going to be when you go to use the GSA, that's going to be part of your documentation to show it wasn't cheaper under state contract, you relied on Office of State Procurement. On the bottom, you'll notice they have links. On every contract file you're going to look at, the first one is going to be to view the actual contract. They're going to usually have some notes, which is going to kind of tell you if there's been amendments, like to extend the contract and you need to know more specific information for your files. The other big thing is they all have a thing which allows you to export whatever the line items are under the contract. You can export that contract's line items as an Excel file. So if you're a person who likes to search and put things in Excel when you're ordering stuff, that's another way you can kind of put that in your file, especially if you're just looking at compare prices. Kind of like how Angela said, your first step may be, hey, we want to go see what is the price under state contract. That, if nothing else, that may be helping you determine what is the reasonable price you should expect if you bid it out. This will let you basically export that as into a spreadsheet that you can use. So when you go into the contract file, this is what you're going to see. It may not look like what you normally think of with a contract, but this is what state procurement basically has as their actual contract. It gives you, again, those details of who is the buyer, in this case, who is the Office of State Procurement's liaison, who's the vendor, what are the terms, and then at the bottom, I only showed you the first page of it, but it will show you as this has been amended either to add additional vehicles or in this case to also extend the term into 2024. Now, one of the things they have in the category is called additional information. Those you always want to check because depending on the contract, there may be very specific information. In this case, this gives you information on how do you order. If you want to use the state contract, how do you order from their vendor? And this information basically tells you, you go to fleet.la.gov. It tells you who the contact person is, and then gives you a list of the vehicles, both by the type, class, but more what we're used to, like a Chevy Trailblazer. So that when you're looking for a vehicle, you can see, is that vehicle under the state contract? Now, if you go to fleet.la.gov, you would think it would say fleet.la.gov. Well, if you put that in your search engine, you're going to get to the feature contract page. So don't think you've lost, that you're lost and don't know where you're at. What you have to do is go, it'll take you to feature contracts. You'll have to scroll down to where you get to vehicle contracts. The first area you're really going to look at is the instructions, which are going to basically have instructions for both state agencies as well as for local governments. So when you go to that, this document tells you step by step, which most of it lays out the same things that we've kind of talked about earlier, making sure you document the contract file, that it's open and that's a contract that's actually accessible to be used to purchase, that it hasn't expired. Once you go through this, they're going to also lay out what the purchase order has to kind of document. This is important because this is what you also want to make sure if you're getting it and you get that copy of the invoice, you want to compare it to what they're telling you this is going to have to make sure you have all that information. So it's going to have what the contract item is, the line items, how much you're getting it, what are you getting, things of those sorts. They do suggest, and this is where they don't necessarily require, but Office of State Procurement strongly suggests that you use to complete it, you use their order sheet, because their order sheet, as we'll see, already has the price for the vehicle, so that you can see what state contract price is. But it also is something when that vendor sees it, the dealer, they're going to know exactly what contract you're talking about, and that they know this is the pricing they're supposed to use. They again remind you, if you're going to use this contract with your local dealer, you got to actually submit this to OSP. And this is where they tell you that person who's in charge of the contract, Ms. Gautreaux, you're supposed to email her a copy of your purchase order. What we would strongly recommend is you complete all of these steps, including submit it before you take delivery, so that there's no question you followed all these steps before the dealer doesn't have to deal with you anymore. Because you want to make sure you have everything, and that invoice you're going to send to OSP actually has all the information they're expecting to see, and that you completed it. Now, if you go where we looked at before, where it said vehicles, and you scroll down, they actually have those contracts for like the statewide vehicle contracts. If we look here, we can see again that contract for Jerry Lane and for Chevy Trailblazer. When you, under this menu, you'll see a thing that says the order forms. The order sheet is, when you go to it, is going to actually be a document that shows you the unit price for the vehicles under the state contract, what packages are available under the state contract. Like we noted earlier, if there's something you want as a package and it's not under the state contract, and they also make sure you understand that in the instructions, you need to reach out to the Office of State Procurement. They're the entity, because it's their contract. They may, if they choose, negotiate with that and amend the contract to add that additional equipment or add-ons. But without that, if you want that and they're not going to add it to the contract, you're going to have to bid it out, because you can't use the state contract at that point because you're not getting the item under state contract. Now, Angela talked earlier about fuel. You'll note under the vehicle contracts, they have a section called vehicle-related contracts. And this is where the state has some of its contracts for flex fuel and fuel for actual fuel under a state contract, as well as other vehicle-related things for equipment and things that you might, tires and such like that. So it's good to know if you're looking for pricing, or if you're going to bid it out, they do at least have some of this information you can use to base how you're going to go about that. Now, as anything for a state agency, they have forms that they expect people to use. In order to use state contracts, a local government has to first make sure that they have basically completed a questionnaire and been basically approved and certified that you are who you say you are, so that Joe Blow off the street doesn't say they're the city of X or the village of Y and trying to buy it using a state contract. So the first thing you'll see is there is a questionnaire link, and then there is a document that will basically show at the bottom a list of everyone that OSP has already certified. I will note this certification process appears to also be what they use, what OSP uses to certify you for the GSA website, because a lot of cities and parishes, they've already gone in and pretty much pre-certified you. but you want to make sure you don't want to just count on it and then find out when you really need that vehicle, you can't complete the purchase. So that questionnaire, I would envision that it will be updated shortly because it still has our former governor's name at the top. But essentially, this is going to be your contact information, who you are as a political subdivision, who are your contacts for your purchasing, so that they can put you in the system. That list, that link we talked about, essentially it's a spreadsheet, and it will note not only who the entity is, who the contact information is, but when they were approved. So some of these have been approved for years, in some cases decades. One thing I would suggest is look, because even if you are already approved and certified, look at who your contact person is. You may want to submit updated contact information, especially if you were somebody that was certified, say in the 90s. I would say it's probably a good bet you have a different person as your contact. And in some cases, your entity may have changed names if you're like a special district or things of that sort. So OSP has some general guidance that they put out there. And this kind of goes into what Angela was talking about earlier about these national co-ops. So the Office of State Procurement has the ability to create what they call Louisiana Multiple Award Schedule contracts, LAMAs. Those can be based on federal GSA contracts. So in some cases, the GSA contract list may actually be a state contract as well. But they, in addition, may also contract out with those national co-ops. So Sourcewell, NASPO. In those cases, you should note that doesn't mean any contract that entity has. It's going to be the specific contract. So if you go look in the contracts, for one thing, Sourcewell, there are several contracts them and TIPS have, like for flooring. The state actually adopted those contracts a few years ago, like after the 2016 floods and the hurricanes, because there was some good pricing from vendors not in Louisiana and down here where all the materials were more scarce. But you want to check that individual contract level, because as Angela pointed out, the AG has said, you as a political subdivision cannot just go, even though that Texas co-op says, hey, our state law says we can extend our pricing to you, that doesn't mean you can accept it because you're subject to the public bid law. And so you can't just say, oh, they bid it out, they did these things, but if they didn't do it under Louisiana law, the AG says you can't use those. But state purchasing can look at those contracts, and if they're beneficial, they're not required to, but they may adopt them as a state contract. And as Angela pointed out earlier, once it's a state contract, then you can use it as a state contract. The statewide contracts, again, they can extend those to quasi-agencies and political subdivisions, but it is important to note not all state contracts are accessible by locals. There are some agency-specific contracts or closed contracts which are limited in who can use them, just by the sake of the type of contract they are. So you always want to look, just because it is a state contract doesn't mean it's one you can use. And so you may want to double check if there's a question with whoever the agent's Office of State Procurement's person is under that contract. Office of State Procurement uses, like any agency, whether it's state, federal, military, they love their acronyms. And so here's some helpful ones. Again, like that LAMAs, those multiple award contracts, scheduled contracts, those are basically those ones where they're taking like GSA or some outside co-op and adopting those prices. They're just basically adopting the contract. They're not creating their own contract. Whereas invitation to bid, it sounded like it cut out. Invitation to bid is going to be important. And again, that ECAT is going to be where you're going to be looking for those contracts. So we kind of talked about where the state procurement has all this information. But let's talk about some scenarios and how you would use that information and those exceptions for state contracts. So we have the City of Public Works. They basically had some vehicles breakdown. That's been kind of the issue a lot of people have had the last few years, especially, unfortunately, at times where vehicles aren't available to be bought. They know that replacing those is going to cost over $60,000 for those 3 vehicles. So you have the mayor basically saying, hey, look, we need to get those ASAP. I know the state usually has pickup trucks and that we may be able to get them from a local dealer. So what options would the city have if they wanted to basically get those trucks without bidding? Well, as we talked about it, if there's a state contract, they can go look and find that state contract. They can buy it from the state's vendor And if it is a local vendor, true local vendor, they can purchase it using the state contract as the source for buying it, but with that small markup. And again, they need to make sure whatever those markups are clearly documented, and that they're also specifically making sure that those markups are submitted to, that invoice is sent to the Office of State Procurement, because they're going to basically document those, and they have administrative reasons why they're going to want to do that. So kind of similar question, you got some equipment that we see it on the federal GSA list. They want to know, can they go buy these without bid them out? They know it's going to be over $80,000. So what concerns would you have if someone came to you and said, hey, can we just go buy this off the GSA? I heard somebody say something. Yes, you're going to want to look first. Is it under state contract? Is that something that, if it's not under state contract, then you can keep moving forward? Or if it is it cheaper? And so you're going to want those things. Now, I would suggest you really want to look not just, hey, is this brand name under the state contract? Look for, kind of like Angela talked about, when you're bidding it out, you're looking for functional equivalents. You're going to want to look for, is there something similar under a state contract before you go spend more under GSA? Because even if you could, you got to keep in mind Article 7, Section 14, that we want to be good stewards of public funds. If that were your money and you had the chance to get the Nissan or the Ford, and the Nissan was $40,000 cheaper, probably going to go with the Nissan in that case. So you want to make sure that you're following the procedures and you're documenting them. But I think in the bigger picture, you're wanting to make sure that if you're using this process, you're doing it in a way as a good steward of public funds to get the best price you can. Because really, the public bid law, state procurement for agencies, and the federal, the thing to always keep in mind is the idea is you're spending the public taxpayer money. We want to make sure you're competitive, as Angela said, arm's length cost, that it is a reasonable cost you're paying for those items. So we're not going to go ahead and take the break now because we took a pretty long one before that. So we'll kind of move forward a little bit. So federal procurement. The thing to understand with federal procurement, even though it's federal dollars, we still need to keep Article 7, Section 14 in mind, that it's still the public fisc. It still includes the taxpayers' money, your money as taxpayers. And so we want to be good stewards. It's a good policy no matter what, because we got to remember it's not our money. Well, the federal standards, some things to understand is, just because you're using federal dollars doesn't mean you don't have to follow the state and local procurement rules that are in place. In fact, as we'll see, the feds remind you, you have to follow the federal standards in addition to your local rules. And so this can kind of be, people find it kind of intimidating because like, oh, it's more rules I got to follow. But I would tell you, take a breath and realize in most cases, while the thresholds again will change and there will be some differences, it's not exactly something different. If you're following the public bid law for your purchases, and in many cases it's going to be your stricter one we'll talk about, you're going to meet what the feds want in most cases. But we'll talk about where that's kind of different as we walk through the federal standards. The biggest thing that is different besides the thresholds is federal procurement services are covered. So when you're purchasing things, you have to consider the services you purchase. Whereas, as Angela talked about earlier, for the public bid law, locals, while we recommend it because of Article 7, Section 14 to do RFPs and competitive negotiations, the public bid law doesn't apply to services. Federal law, it does. And anyone who's familiar with the state procurement code, it is much more similar to the feds in that sense because it's more holistic. We don't care what you're buying, we care how much you're spending for what you're buying. The last thing is kind of, as we start talking about the federal stuff, is to remember, document everything. Because if we're talking expenditure of federal grant money, you're given that money, and in some cases you may be given it up front. You want to make sure you've documented how you followed every rule you potentially have to follow so that at the end of the day, you don't have to give the money back. Because once that money's spent, it may be hard to come up with money, or it's going to take away money from other sources to pay them back. If it's reimbursement, so we're talking FEMA after a hurricane, when you're making those expenditures, you're going to want to make sure you carefully make those expenditures so that at the end of the day, you get reimbursed. Because in the case of disaster spending, we're talking millions in many cases, and sometimes tens of millions. And that would be really bad for you and your taxpayers if that money that you were counting on being reimbursed to respond to that disaster wasn't accounted for. The last big topic before we details that I would say, remember if you're dealing with a federal grant or you're dealing with a federal specific program such as public service, public assistance, you want to make sure they may have specific rules that are in addition to these rules. Or there may be certain exceptions they're allowed where you don't have to follow things. So in all cases, whether you're getting grant money or doing a reimbursement program, you want to make sure that you're following the rules that are specific to that program. That said, 2 CFR is basically the federal Code of Federal Regulations, and for those, you can find this online. There are links if you go to the Library of Congress or to the U.S. House of Representatives, actually has a link to this. This is essentially the federal government's equivalent to the state's administrative code. This is where they basically, as they promulgate stuff and they codify it, it gets published in the Federal Register as the Code of Federal Regulations. So as those agencies do rulemaking, it gets codified into the CFRs. 2 CFR Part 200 has become kind of the go-to for any state agencies, state government, local governments, or any tribal governments or quasis that get federal grant dollars for reimbursement programs. This provision is going to apply to all of those, whether it's grant programs or reimbursement programs, to ensure that you are getting those best dollars. It keeps sounding like it's cutting out. The local governments, this is very important because while state governments, they basically have to follow their normal rules, so the state procurement code. Whereas local governments, when you're dealing with those grant dollars and those FEMA dollars that you're trying to get reimbursed, you have to not only follow your state and local rules, but you have to follow these additional rules in complying. It's important to note in case of disasters, because Louisiana seems to be a magnet for them lately. All federal declared disasters as of December of 2014 have to follow 2 CFR. Those disasters before, so like anyone who dealt with issues like in Katrina, or maybe still dealing with Katrina for closeout, those previous CFRs that dealt with those individual programs, those still apply. But as we got to December 26, 2014, if there's a federally declared disaster, they now have to comply under either whether it's FEMA or any grants with 2 CFR Part 200, in addition to specific grant or reimbursement rules. So 2 CFR 200-317, this basically tells the state, follow your rules. Whatever your normal rules are, follow them. And so for state agencies, it's pretty simple. For locals, you have to make sure you're complying with these standards, which, like I said, take a breath. Most of them, if you're following the public bid law requirements, you're already doing what they're asking for. And we'll talk about in a couple of cases where there are some differences, but it really shouldn't be a difference if you're really trying to be a good steward. Again, remember, 2 CFR 200 includes services in addition to your materials and supplies and public works. So non-federal entities, that basically our local government. The biggest thing the feds want is they want to make sure, because in cases of, say, disaster procurement, people are usually not in the best state of mind because, one, you're worrying about handling your job, and you're also worried, is my house still standing? They want to know going into it for consistency's sake and to make sure you follow the same procedures no matter who handles it in your agency, to have some written procedures documented. So that says, if we have procurement between less than 10,000, this is what we're going to do. And so you're going to be documenting how you're following the state law, any local ordinances that may be inapplicable, because like Angela said, a public entity can say, hey, look, we're going to bid everything out from 20,000 up. They can do that. Feds say if you have that rule, you have to follow it, even though you're not using state or local funds. You also want to make sure you're showing how you're complying with these standards, how you're going to be competitive, because that is really the theme, if you look at all of these standards, is competitive and fair pricing. They're also going to want to make sure you have things, which is important, like Angela said, just because you award a contract, that's not the end of it. And the feds especially want to know you're monitoring from the time you award that contract to the time it's over, that you're making sure that vendor and contractor is doing what you actually got them to bid and submit a bid for and what you paid your money for. That you get, if you ordered a vehicle that has a certain trim, you get a vehicle and it is that trim. The other thing is, similar to what we have under our state code of governmental ethics, we want to make sure you have some places, some standards and controls in place that when you're doing your procurement, how are we going to avoid situations where that local vendor isn't helping us draft what we're going to bid out and then submit a bid? State law has its own restrictions, but the feds are uniquely looking at this because a lot of times, unfortunately, people see it, oh, it's federal dollars, so we don't need they don't think of the Article 7, Section 14 type situation. They don't think of it as, oh, these are public money. They are public money. And in the feds, they will come back for their money if you don't do it right. So you want to make sure you really have a manual. And if you think about it, why wouldn't you, as Angela said earlier, why wouldn't you want this anyway? Because why wouldn't you want that person who has to make these decisions already have those things thought out so that they're really just following a script? They know if we're buying something that's a recurring purchase, we're considering how much we spend in a year. We're not just looking at the individual purchase. We're looking at, okay, if we have this thing and we normally don't have to deal with procurement for services, but that manual says if it's involving federal reimbursement or a grant, we are specifically making sure that we're following these additional rules because it's federal money. That should all be easily documented, and charts are really good. Like Angela showed you earlier for the, she had that slide that was for the piggybacking. Show them what those steps are, break it down in simple terms. Because if you think about it, if you're using it from a federal reimbursement program, again, you just had a federal declared disaster. That person needs all the help they can get to follow kind of navigate those rules. The other aspect that you have to think about with this is, if we're talking about disaster, you may have disaster specific guidance that gets added on top of this. So you want these general rules to be in place, and then you want to make sure that you have, so that person, there's no question of, we had calls a couple of weeks ago where someone said, hey, look, we did this, we didn't do it right, what can we do? Well, have you taken delivery? No. Well, cancel, get with your attorney, cancel everything you can do and do it right. Because you don't want to do it wrong. Now, the other thing that kind of goes with this, which makes sense if we stick to that mantra of Article 7, Section 14, don't buy things that aren't necessary or duplicative. The feds are like, just because we're giving you this money and it's not your normal appropriated or tax money that you raise yourself, don't think of it as just money from heaven. You want to make sure you're buying it because it's needed. The other thing is you want to make sure, again, that records. The way I tell people is, if you're using federal grant dollars, or more importantly, you're kind of taking the leap of faith to buy it, hoping you're going to get reimbursed, think of it as though you're going to go before the bank for a loan. What documentation would you bring to a bank to justify why they should give you that loan? Should be no different than what you're doing with the feds to say, hey, look, we followed your rules. We did this. This is why it was reasonable. Here's how we did it. Here's why we did it. Tell us what we did wrong. Drop the mic. So, I mean, those are the things you want to document. It's also important because, as anybody's dealt with the federal closeout program process, it can take years. And so people come and go, things go stale. So by having this documentation, as like Angel said, it doesn't need to be paper. In fact, I would say try to avoid paper where you can. Do it electronic. Electronic's easier to back up. It's easier to restore if you have a disaster that comes again, or search, because when it's digital, you can do full text search. Good luck doing that with paper. But you want to document these things, and you want to make sure it's so anybody who comes 5 years later can see 5 years later the same things you would have had at that moment to justify what you did. So the mantra that basically this 2 CFR says is they want full and open competition. They want to make sure you're not arbitrarily inflating costs by just kind of giving it sweetheart deals to people, or in the case of elected officials, to their campaign contributors. You want to make sure that you're basically doing what you need to do to get a reasonable price for a fair and reasonable price. So contractors, again, that help with the development cannot include that. You don't want the person who's writing the script to be able to be the one to bid to play it. So in this case, you want to make sure that contractors, if you're going to hire people to specifically help you come up with what that advertisement's going to be, do it with them and having the full knowledge that them nor any of their related entities should be bidding on what they're helping prepare. Which brings up a good point. When we're dealing with federal stuff, especially if it's the first time you're doing that manual or following these rules, you may want to hire someone that specifically has experience with this, either going forward or at least to initially kind of help you come up with what your controls and procedures are going to be so that you are in compliance. Now, I will caution you, don't just write a manual and then 10 years later still use the same manual you drafted, because these rules change and you're going to want to make sure it's fresh and updated. So you might want to just have someone that again, that could be a service where you're hiring some professional attorney or somebody that's an accountant that does this stuff to come in, help you kind of consult and do that. Under state law, if you're using local funds and state and local funds, that's going to be a service. You don't have to bid it out. But you might want to do an RFP, or in this case, an RFQ, so you get someone you know is qualified to do this work, because you're basically hoping whatever instructions and advice they give you is right. Now, geographical preferences, just like Angela talked about where the AG had told New Orleans they couldn't have things that say we're only going to allow people who are in New Orleans to bid, or if you get this contract, you have to use New Orleans residents. Geographical preferences to the Fed are generally not favored, unless certain programs allow it under federal law, or specifically architecture and engineering. If you think about it, there's a reason for that, because the architect and engineer usually know state building codes and they know local building codes. And so there is an allowance for that geographical preference. And like Angela said, architectural engineering services for locals are services. You're not required to bid them out because they're not under the bid law. It is highly recommended you do an RFQ, because the state does have a general public policy that you should not consider price when awarding a contract to someone that's an architect engineer, because we don't want to go cheap. I mean, that's how buildings fall down, and that's how you get in like engineering classes as like disasters. So you want to make sure you have these. Again, for competition, you want written selection procedures. So
Patrick, I have an online question.
Okay, sure.
What about tips contracts for materials and installation if licensed in the state of Louisiana but not located in Louisiana? If they are lower than a state contract, can you go with the tips contract?
If it's materials and supplies, you can't just go with them, because they're a federal co-op. If that specific contract has been adopted by the Office of State Procurement, then it's a state contract and you can use it. If it's services, then it's services. Services aren't included. You're not required to bid it out in the first place, but you may want to consider at least solicit some quotes from locals that provide the same services to just show that it's a reasonable cost. The feds, in doing this, they want you to basically have a plan before you go into it. Anyone who's familiar with federal disaster, like the public assistance program, knows one of the things the feds have done is, because debris removal contracts, which, as like Angela pointed out earlier, the AG has said that service all day long. It's not a material supply, not a public work. But because it's a service and federal government requires certain things, the feds have actually said, hey, go do these contracts before it happens. It's going to be cheaper in most cases, but this way you're just activating a contract that you already have negotiated. You're not rushing to try to do it where you don't have a lot of competition, because when you're trying to clear roads, there's only so many in the area that can do it, and usually there's even less that can do it in the short time period you need. So what they want is written procedures that basically say, if we're going to put this out, here's what we're going to put in the ad, here's the timeline we're going to do. basically don't just do it by the seat of your pants, have a plan. That in that sense, they also want you to basically look for who are people, if we bid this out and advertise it, who are people that would potentially respond that would be responsible and responsive. This doesn't mean you can they have to be pre-qualified. In fact, under public bid law, you can't pre-qualify people. People have the ability to submit bids. What this is the feds are saying, you should have an idea of who could be potential contractors from that contract, send out information to them, so target your advertisements in addition to your general advertising. So we talked about that thresholds are different for the feds. The feds really have three major thresholds you should be aware of. The first one is micro purchases. This is essentially 10,000 and under. This is different than the public bid law, which basically doesn't even kick in. But if you're basically following those recommendations that we and the AG kind of historically have recommended, that go get 3 quotes, you're going to be fine under the feds because it showed you due diligence and that you tried to at least get a competitive. This may be going on Google and doing Google shopping and say, I'm looking for XYZ, and then just documenting what the costs are from different places and show that what you've spent was reasonable. The next threshold we get into is small purchases. This should not be confused if you've ever dealt with the state procurement code, but this is basically anything over 10,000 but less than 250,000. And that's a big jump when you're dealing with the feds. This case, you need to get price quotes. This is going to be very similar to your 30 to 60 under public bid for material supplies. The key thing again is you got to document those. So again, if you're doing what you're supposed to do, excuse me, for that 30 to 60, you're complying with this. Where you can get into trouble is forgetting that once you get to 60,000, even though the feds don't care until you get to 250, public bid law says once you get to 60, you have to bid it out unless you're using one of those alternatives. So you do need to remember in that case, the state law is going to be your stricter law for material supplies once you hit that $60,000 threshold. Not a problem for public works because it just so happens to be the same 250,000, at least for now. But like Angela pointed out, there's some legislation that was introduced that could change that. So once we get to the 200, oh, go ahead. So if there's a circumstance, because I would note in the definition for micro purchases as well as small purchases, that 250,000 may be different for certain items. So there could be specific items that have a lower threshold or some that have a higher. But if the feds have a higher restriction for you, case in point, for the micro purchases, for state law, if it's under 10,000, state law doesn't care. It doesn't tell you have to do anything. For micro purchases, thank you. Once the feds actually care at that 10,000 up to 30,000, you have to go get quotes and you have to document those. It's not as formal as it is once it's over the 10,000 because it doesn't have to be competitive. It can just be local vendors, but it's still more than what the state requires. And that would be the same thing as if you had a circumstance where the Fed said, this has to be bid out no matter what, because maybe because of prior abuses. Some circumstances, they may, even your grant program may have stricter requirements so that anything over 10,000, they may say, we don't care that the feds normally don't require bids. You're going to bid it out because we want to know that that money was spent properly. So you have to follow that stricter. So what we always tell people is, if you follow the stricter law in almost all cases, you're going to be okay. One of the things, and we'll talk about in a minute, when it comes to your invitation to bid, so like when you're doing your public works or you're bidding out material supplies, the feds are a little more particular about what you get as responses. So when we get to seal bids, this is essentially the bid process that you would normally follow when you're bidding out a public works project over 250,000, or if your materials and supplies over 60. You're basically advertising and saying, there's a deadline for you to submit bids. This is what we're asking for. You get to that, you open it, you award it to someone. What's different with the feds is, under public bid law, Let's say you do a public works project. You advertise properly, you put it out there, and you only get one person. Under state law, you can accept that every day of the week, and you're good. The feds, in the words of Lee Corso, not so fast, my friend. They want to show competition. They want you to show that in using this method, you're going to get 2 or more. Because their idea is, yeah, I could advertise it, but if I know I pick the date and it just so happens to be a date that's the local festival or a state holiday, the idea is they want to make sure. But the other part of this is you're not just putting it in the paper. You are specifically taking those people, those pre-qualified lists you had, and you're sending it to those entities saying, hey, we're putting this out for bid. Here's the bid opening date. You need to have your bid by this date turned in. Maybe consider submitting. And so you're targeting people to do it. I would suggest that's probably not a bad idea for under state law anyway, because if we're really doing what Article 7, Section 14, and you really want to make sure you're getting a fair price, you're going to want to make sure. One thing is we've had people say, okay, what happens if I'm doing this? I know I'm going to get federal reimbursement. We're like 2 days from the bid close, and we don't only have one person to bid. What should we do? I would suggest use the process that's under the public bid law to extend the bid opening, look for those people who haven't submitted bids, and maybe say, hey, by the way, if you didn't see our advertisement, you might want to submit a bid. Here's the new deadline. And so that's for the feds, you're going to have to do that process because you got to get at least 2 people. Otherwise, they're going to deem it non-competitive. There are some exceptions we'll talk about where non-competitive can be allowed, but I would never depend on it. So again, this is basically something that where it lends itself to someone putting in a fixed or a unit price, like a public works or material supplies, where it's like, hey, look, we want this. You're going to give it. You're going to charge us at Y. So sealed bids, again, it's the same thing that you had under public bid. It's going to be to your lowest responsible and responsive bidder. You want to make sure that the opening and timing of the opening is done properly. Again, you want to make sure you can reject any and all of them as long as you follow the proper procedures. So again, a circumstance, if everything comes in over budget, that's probably going to be just cause under state law, as well as the feds to just say, we're going to step back. And so the feds have the same kind of considerations of canceling bids. Now, RFPs.
I have another online question.
Okay.
Is there a reason to advertise in the local paper for specific items, like i.e. medical equipment that you know are not produced or sold within your parish?
Can you repeat that? Can you repeat that question?
Is there a specific reason to advertise in local paper for specialty items such as medical equipment if you know that they are not produced or sold within your parish?
I mean, I think the key thing with the purpose of following the advertisement is you're following the law, which requires you to advertise on certain things. Now, I would suggest if you know that there's no one in the local paper that does it, you should be advertising in other places as well, because there's nothing that restricts you from doing additional advertising. So you may want to advertise in the Advocate, even though you're maybe in a small parish. Because again, the key thing is you're looking for competition. In the case of the feds, they demand competition. So RFPs, just like Angela talked about, in the case there are certain circumstances where it's beneficial. You want to make sure these are going to be the circumstances where you don't necessarily want to depend just on price, but you're going to have other considerations. So what is advantageous, because it's a mixture of things. Go ahead. Gotcha. Have you invited him to go fishing? Invite him to go fishing. Yeah. I think the key things with from a federal standpoint, the question was down in Grand Isle. Yeah, the question was basically down in Grand Isle, they're having issues getting people to come down because they're so remote, and trying to, for competition purposes, getting people to submit bids because nobody wants to come and do the work down there. The thing I would say is, under state law, follow your procedures, try to see what you can do to mitigate that. For the federal side, document what you're doing to mitigate that. Because in some cases, they may still authorize it because you've documented, we didn't just do the minimum, we did this, we did that, we did this, kind of what Angela said, you're documenting those things so people understand what you did and why you did it. At the end of it, there are procedures where they can accept non-competition, where basically even after trying to do it, you just couldn't get it. And so certain things, it just may be a reliance on, there's not a lot of people that provide that specific service in the first place, but that's where you're going to be documenting those things in your files. That's where documentation kind of will set you free, because you've shown that you've tried to do it and it's just not working.
And Patrick, for federal procurement, if you're subject to that for materials and supplies, are you allowed to use state contract, or you still have to get the quotes?
State contract, they're more permissive on allowing state contract. Where you get into issues where they usually deem it non-competitive is where you're piggybacking off of another political subdivisions contract. The feds, kind of in the same vein where they tell state agencies, follow your own rules, there's more deference usually given by the feds to the contracts the state does, because they're expecting that those were done through a competitive process in the first place. That was fully competitive, and it was not just a local contract, but was a statewide type contract, which had a lot of competition. So generally speaking, state contracts, it's okay. Again, you want to check your specific program or grant rules, because in some circumstances, they may say, we're not going to say that's competitive. So when in doubt, check your specific rules. So RFPs, similar process. You're soliciting proposals from people. The key thing, again, is you want to make sure you have criteria and that you follow that criteria in how you award it. Because one of the things, just because you have criteria doesn't mean all criteria are equal. You may have circumstances where price is a really big consideration, whereas you may have others where things working are more important, especially if it's life and death things like with ambulances or with healthcare, where price it's still important, it's always going to be important, but it's nowhere near the top of the list of important. And so those criteria, you should really evaluate how you're going to weight them and make sure that's clear, so that when people are submitting and you're grading those, the people who grade it and the people who get graded understand how they got the grade and why they graded it the way they did. Engineering and architectural, just like the state doesn't really want you to consider price, it's heavily recommended to do a request for qualifications, because again, the point there is we want the most qualified person to design and construct those buildings that get constructed, not necessarily the cheapest. And so again, it's going to be find someone who's qualified and then come out with whatever's fair and reasonable pricing. So non-competitive proposals. These are kind of like with emergency, and you'll note, public urgency, instead of saying public urgency will not permit delay. So if you have the feds have their own version of the emergency exception. If you can document that, hey, look, there was a hole in the roof, we had to take these actions, we couldn't wait and do competitiveness because we need to save the building. The whole point of that is you're going to document how that meets that exception. Sole source, just like Ann just said, it's almost impossible these days. Really, the only way I could kind of formulate in my head where you might have a sole source is something like chemicals, like fighting mosquitoes. Somebody comes out to market with a new mosquito chemical for treatment, and they're the only one who makes it. No one else makes it. No one else sells it. That may be like the uniqueness for sole source. Because remember, under state law, you have to accept functional equivalence. You can't just say, I want this brand. So just because that person, the example I always use is Mac computers. Apple is the only person who makes Macs, unless it's a knockoff. But they're not the only people who sell it. You can go to Best Buy, you can go to Walmart, you can go to Sam's, you can go to Costco. All of them sell Apple products. So those are the people that would solicit for competition, the actual people selling them. So we also see this a lot of times with law enforcement. Well, they're the only one who makes this. Well, I bet you if you get online, Jennifer always tells us, I bet you if you go on Google, I bet you can find some other ones that do the same thing. They may call it something different, but probably does the same functional issues. So there's really not true sole source in this day and age. If you find it, congratulations, you found the holy unicorn. So purchases below the micro purchase, as we talked about, those purchases under $10,000, the feds expect you to do some work, but they're less concerned on how competitive it is. They just kind of want you to still show some reasonableness. And then that last one, after solicitation, this goes to our example from Grand Isle, You've done everything you can. You've documented that, hey, look, we did this. We even went and said, please submit a bid. And you document, hey, we faxed or emailed or sent this to these people. They still didn't submit a bid. This is your documentation to show that, again, that doesn't mean that federal agency for the grant or the reimbursement will accept it, but they're more likely to accept it if they've shown that you've done everything you can do and it still didn't work. And again, local governments, you have to follow the public bid law. So you need to make sure what you're doing actually follows both the federal requirements and the state requirements. Some other issues that kind of arise, because we're dealing with federal programs and federal money, the feds often have additional requirements. One of those is affirmative action. It's been a federal requirement since the 60s. Basically, you need to make sure in doing anything that's expending federal dollars, you're taking steps to make sure you're not keeping out minority women's firms and any of those utilized areas, business areas, that they're at least getting a fair shot at your competition and competing for your stuff. You know, that you're not basically drafting things up intentionally to keep them from being able to participate in that competition. Cost and price, this is kind of the big thing for the feds. Anything you spend that's over $250,000, but I would suggest anything you spend, you need to make sure you can justify, because again, you still have that requirement that you're not duplicitous, you're not buying stuff just to buy it. Like you don't have pallets of water just sitting there or ice that doesn't get used and melt. You need to be able to show why it was reasonable and that it was a fair price to spend the money you were spending. What they're essentially wanting you to do is do some kind of analysis, not just, hey, this is this. This goes to that documentation idea that you want to make sure when you're going, let's say you're getting ice before a storm. We know, hey, look, there's a potential because of the grid. Our past experiences have been, it may be a week before it's a reliable energy. We need ice to be available, both for the first responders that have to stay in the area, but as well as for people maybe who are stuck. We have an aging population. We have a nursing home in our area. Whatever those are, that justifies why you're making the expenditures. And so the other part of this is how you did the expenditure. That whatever you did was done either in accordance with the standards or because of urgency. These are the things we attempted to do these things, but we maybe did it a shorter period of time because it needed to get done. So you want to do all these things. Now, one thing that must be done is you have to do an independent analysis when you're going to get bids and proposals. As Angela pointed out, for the public bid law, especially public works, the law now actually requires you get some kind of estimation. And like Angela pointed out, you have to include labor, materials, equipment, all of those things in determining that cost. But that exercise is also important because that helps you base to whether or not you need to cancel all bids. Well, the feds say, we don't care, you're going to do this anyway. If you're putting it out for bids, you need to independently, even though the idea is, well, by competition, it's arm's length transaction. Well, their thing is, you need to know if maybe something's hinky because none of them seem to match what you expected. And so they want you, before you actually do the process, to kind of do some kind of self-evaluation so that when you get the bids, you can compare not only what you get, but what you get to what you think should be reasonable. Because the feds really get into the idea of price fixing. They don't want vendors conspiring to, hey, we're all going to bid high, so you get this one. We'll all bid high, so this other one gets it. It happens. And so feds want to make sure you're really, just because that's the only bid you got, they were still reasonable bids. So the big thing the feds have is there are certain types of contracts that they allow and that they deem acceptable, and there are certain types they do not allow at all. And then there's a kind of a mid one where you can do it, but there are certain things that you kind of have to do to use that type of contract. So the easiest one that we all know is a lump sum contract. I will give you $1,000 if you go mow the grass. So it's a lump sum. I'm going to give you a fixed amount of money to do fixed, well-defined scope of services. that's always going to be acceptable. In fact, that's the most preferable when you can do it because it's clear. I'm going to give you this much money, and in return, you're going to provide this service or this material. Unit price, this is going to be more where you're doing, especially like public works type situations, where we know we're using lumber. We may not know how much square foot we need. It's kind of an estimate. So what we do is that per unit is done on a unit pricing. It would be the same thing if it's a service, say like you're rendering psychiatric services or something under a federal program. So many visits or things of that will be done as a unit price. The more units you provide, the more you're going to get that fixed price per unit. Cost plus a fixed fee, this is basically your lump sum or unit price, but the contractor says, look, we're also going to charge you $1,000 because that's our overhead in addition to the actual what we're charging you for the material or the service. Those are all allowable. Where you get into the situation where you can accept is time and materials. This is basically where you have some kind of materials, but you're also charging a labor charge in addition to that. Classic example of this is debris removal. If you're going to do time and materials, you have to have monitoring because the idea is when you're dealing with labor, you don't want people to overrun the cost because you didn't monitor it. The classic example for debris removal is we're going to pay you by a truckload of how much you bring to the dump. Well, if I'm not monitoring you and you start bringing in 3/4 of a truck and counting those as whole trucks, we have a problem. And so we end up paying for more than we really should have because we didn't monitor it. There also needs to be a cost ceiling if you're going to do a time and material contract. The idea is even if all the monitoring in the world fails, you're limiting your exposure because if you don't have an exposure limit, if it's based on that labor, they can inflate the numbers and then you're basically spending way more than you planned to from the beginning. The final thing that is a restriction is it has to be for a limited period of time. Previously, it was more the first 70 hours, so like cleaning the roads. The idea is we can go out, we're going to do a time and materials contract, but it's only for 70 hours. Now it's basically, it can be longer, but it's got to have a clear scope of work. So the idea is you want to focus and limit the potential for issues as much as possible. So the unacceptable contract types, and these are ones where we get into a situation where if you look at what they're saying you can't do, you understand why they say you can't do it. So a cost plus a percentage of the cost. The idea being, I'm going to charge you as a vendor this much for material and supply and a percent of whatever that is. Well, there's no incentive for me to keep your costs low because the more I sell or do for you, the more I make. And so there's no cost run kind of built into protection. So it's more rife for people to kind of game the system. So contingency contracts. I think it's important to understand what we mean by a contingency contract. For example, under the Public Assistance Program for FEMA, local government cannot execute contracts that state they will pay and be liable to the contractor if and only when FEMA says they approve the reimbursement. Because the idea behind this is you're really supposed to be getting reimbursed for costs that have been actually incurred. If you're doing a situation where you're not really doing reimbursement at that point, is what the feds look at it as. You really have to incur an obligation that's a true obligation to get reimbursed for it. Because the idea is you don't really have a cost if the feds disavow it. And the idea is it goes against the spirit of a reimbursement program if you're just kind of fictitiously creating a liability. And so contingency, that doesn't mean you can't have certain things that say if certain conditions are met. The key is that liability that you actually incur a cost. It can't be a contract that's contingent on the feds or the grant, the agency on the grant program approving the expenditure. You really you have to take the leap, is I guess the simplest way to say it. It needs to be a true obligation, recognized. So I think the big summary that we kind of go from federal procurement, remember in all cases, we have to follow not only these federal guidelines, but we still have to follow the public bid law, and we still have to follow those issues that are any local requirements that you've imposed. Because like Angela pointed out, locals have the ability to be stricter. As long as it's compatible with the public bid law, which we always have to remember, public bid law is a prohibitory law, which means you follow those rules or else. And so we need to always be mindful that there are multiple layers of rules that apply. But again, like I said, take a breath, realize that in most cases, while the thresholds change, you're still really, as long as you're following the bid law in most cases, you're going to be okay with the feds. The difference being, if you're sending things out for bid, you need to make sure you're targeting places to bid and that you're getting at least 2 bids submitted. The next point about this is to remember, when federal money is being involved, services, you have to consider those. Those services need to be accounted for, and remember, it's the threshold you're spending, not what you're spending it for. The feds, it's all inclusive, whether it's materials, construction, or services. They look at what you're spending. And so you could get that disconnect where local law says, it's a service, we don't care what you do, whereas the feds say, you got to follow these rules that you normally don't follow, which goes into our last thing we remind ourselves, document. That's on the front end, having procedures, have some guidelines that say, when we spend money that's either a federal grant or a federal reimbursement program, one, look at what the program rules are, because those could be even more important than these general ones. 2, did we follow the public bid law that's applicable? Did we follow the federal law that's applicable? And then when there's a doubt where one's less restrictive, you're following the more restrictive requirement. And then, of course, you're documenting the actual expenditures, what you did to determine you needed to expend money, that it was a necessary and not duplicate expenditure, that you were documenting how and why we choose what we're going to do. It could be as simple as we're documenting, we decided not to do bids for this service because it made more sense to do an RFP. And this is the criteria, how we established the criteria. Here's how we decided who was going to be on the grading for that. Here's how we made sure we didn't have anybody who had conflicts. And here's how we actually evaluated, and here's what the outcome was of those grading of that criteria. So that 5 years from now, when you're now maybe doing a closeout with FEMA and GOSEP, you have all that properly documented. And again, documenting means, in most cases, electronic. So that it's protected, it's backed up, it's searchable. So you want to make sure you have all those, you're keeping them. And like we talked about earlier, things that are related to expenditure of public funds or the business of your entity, those are public records. So you also want to make sure you're properly maintaining those records in accordance with the public records law in Louisiana. The feds, in some cases, again, may have different restrictions and requirements for how long you keep certain things. So that needs to really be developed in that manual that you come up with. Again, you may want to hire someone, at least on the front end, to help you kind of navigate this quagmire so that it's laid out clearly for people to follow, so that you can depend on the people you're tasking to do it are going to do these steps, so that at the end of the day, you don't have the agency saying these federal grant monies, give them back, or in the case of reimbursement, sorry, we're not going to reimburse you, because that could be really bad in certain circumstances. And we want to make sure we do all these things. We try to leave some time towards the end of this to see if anybody has questions. One of the last things we'll kind of point out is our website for legal assistance. If you go under services, resources, legal services, legal assistance, I'm sorry, we have our legal FAQs, we have FAQs on public bid law, procurement code, those flow charts that Angela pointed out, the vendor, basically the vendor affidavit, is all of that is linked on here, and we update these at least once a year, if not more frequently. So you'll find that latest information there. There's also the ability, if a question comes up after this, you can submit questions to our legal group on our website for those. So with that, now that you guys have had a chance to kind of hear all of this, is there questions you have on anything from public bid all the way to this? I think the key thing is the way
Will
the
you
feds
repeat the
look at it.
question, please?
The question was, what happens if you put out or you're not aware of some entity and you didn't send directly to them? Is that prejudicial? Not necessarily, depending on, you really want to document how you determine those entities, because if you didn't know about them, that can't be prejudicial. But if you intentionally didn't send it to somebody, be prepared to defend why you didn't send it. But I think the feds, that's the idea behind on the front end where you're identifying pre-qualified lists, you're trying to establish those in a fair way. If someone's left off, you've documented maybe why they're not responsible, whatever that reason may be. But the key thing is, if you're really trying to make sure you get at least 2 quotes, I'd be sending them to everybody. Once you get them in, if they're the lowest and you have problems with them, there's a process to disqualify them, both under federal and state.
I have an online question.
Sure.
If you're a nonprofit that gets state or federal funds, do these rules or laws apply to you?
They may, because if you're a nonprofit and you're getting money that's basically you're a quasi-public because you're standing in the shoes carrying out a program, in most cases you're going to be subject to the same rules the entity who's giving you the money is. But even if you aren't, you need to check whatever the agreement is that provides the funds, because in many cases, for instance, with councils on aging, the governor's office in its rules and guidelines prescribes that they're going to follow the public bid law as a condition of receiving the money that they get from the state. So they really do have to check their agreements. The Fed, it's any non-federal agency. So if you're spending federal funds, you're subject to these rules. It doesn't matter. You don't have to be a local government. If you're getting grant money or if you're getting under a reimbursement program, you have to follow their rules to get those reimbursements or the grant monies. If anybody has questions, again, feel free to submit them to us. We're always happy to help. Let me turn off. Oh, it's off. Let me turn this off.
All right, thank you so much. And that ends our CLGE program for today. I just want to extend a few thanks. It always starts with Craig Wiseman and Keith Duke, who work on the back end on our website to make sure that you have everything there and the technology for registration. You all have seen Andre Taylor, Judy Detweiler, Lizzie Scheck-Snyder. We're all running around like chickens with our heads cut off because of our technology issues, trying to solve them. They work real hard behind the scenes. You know Liz Martin. She's like your sister. She answers all your questions, works so hard on this program pretty much year round. Thanks for that. Thanks to all of our presenters as well. They make it such a high quality program. And thanks to you for attending, for spending your very valuable time with us these 2 days. But especially thank you so much for taking care of the citizens of Louisiana the way that you do. I know you make a lot of personal sacrifices in your life to take care of those in our local governments, and we really sincerely mean thank you so much for that. It means a lot to us. You're taking care of our babies. And for that, we're going to have our October. We have the dates already, October 23rd, 24th. Session content to be determined, but that's going to be at Light in Lafayette. So as we develop that content, of course, the routine. We'll post it on the website and all of that. Safe travels. Thank you so much. Enjoy the rest of your day and the springtime.